The first 3 weeks of the eruption here in Hawaii, crazy things would happen in the middle of the night. A new fissure would open up and it would threaten a new neighborhood. Thousands of people were evacuated from their homes. I started the Hawaii Tracker Facebook group to help people understand what's going on and get their questions answered.
Hey, how's it going? We're live. This is Fissure 20.
We had hundreds of people all throughout the neighborhoods sending in videos, articles, and images. We spend a lot of time making sure the accurate information gets out.
This is live. It's still lava moving.
They weren't just sharing a story, they were helping their neighbor. If a family was being evacuated, my group would just jump in and help out. It was huge. They were watching out for each other.
Hello everybody, thank you for coming. Thank you for the support from everybody.
As we go through this, we're growing closer together as a community. When tragedies like this strike, you really realize how much you need each other.
Aloha everyone, I'm geologist Philip Ong, here with Mr. Dane DuPont from HVERI, Hawaiian Volcano Education and Resilience Institute. Today is Thursday, April 4th, 2024. How are you doing, Dane, today?
I'm doing pretty good. You know, just trying to stay dry out there. Been a pretty wet day all around the east side of the island.
Yeah, it sure has been, yeah. I'll point out this couple of funny things happening in our monitoring signals there, but we'll have to wait to see how things clear out there. But long and short of it is there's not a whole lot of change this week from what was happening last week in Kilauea. There are still changes happening. They're the same kind of changes as for the last few weeks, so we'll review that here briefly. But our story today is going to be revisiting the events of 1868. 1868 between March 27th and April 11th, 1868 in particular. There's other stuff that happened that year, but that's that 16-day period in particular. In that time, there were 4 eruptions, 2 in Kilauea, 2 on Mauna Loa, a 7.9 earthquake, probably 2 7-point-something earthquakes, landslide, at least 1, probably 2, maybe 3 tsunami, all in 16 days. So it was really, really intense. There was, as we kind of teased it last week, for people who lived 150 years ago, that was their 2018 world rocking event, right? So
right, yeah, and
we'll get in.
The interesting part to me was how when you started doing all this research, how it turned into a giant rabbit hole where we started out thinking 2 earthquakes, and then there's a third earthquake all of a sudden, and it's like the 1868 is such a heavy event with so much going on that history seems to have forgotten about a magnitude 7.0 earthquake, roughly. We don't know for sure, but that's just crazy when you think about it. When you think about the 2018, the biggest earthquake in that eruption, the 6.9, that just what happened, and there was so much else happening that wasn't worth making a big note about.
Yeah, the rabbit hole goes deep on that one. We'll dive into it a little bit here. So what I'll do is I'll try to run through our regular monitoring update of Kilauea and briefly Mauna Loa a little more quickly this week, and then we'll progress into that 1868 talk, which will use both our synthesized version of that What's Happening 1868 talk that was given at Kahuku by USGS during Volcano Awareness Month earlier this year, and in our own research kind of to supplement it and to help organize it a little bit, because it really was confusing at first to figure out what was going on, and so I had to make a little outline to help guide us through the thing here. So, all right, we are missing our ASL interpreters once again, and we wish they could be here, but unfortunately they are not. So we'll wait them next time. Miss those guys. All right, let's switch our screens around here and get ready for our Hawaiian volcano summary. Make sure my marker is working. All right. So I just had a live look in here for you guys. So, all right. In our Hawaiian volcano summary this week, you can see a look into Kilauea earlier today before the rain came in. Still fuming, still building mineral deposits, and quiet on the surface here. If we look at our monitoring signals at Kilauea Summit, for the last week or so, we've had rising tilt at the summit caldera. This is the Uikahuna station here. And along with a inflation, part of a deflation-inflation cycle, we've had a buildup in earthquakes slightly peaking this week on Sunday. And that was in the shallow regions, as you can see in this depth versus time plot for the last week here. Over the last week, the map looks like this. These are colored by depth. So the blues are deep earthquakes in Pahala. The reds and oranges are these shallow ones of the magma filling the South Caldera and Southwest Rift Connector area. And there's a scattering of these yellow, slightly deeper earthquakes beneath that shallower reservoir system of Kilauea. South flank is still moving and adjusting. You imagine that as magma is coming into this area in here, that it pushes towards the ocean, and that can cause these earthquakes that seem to be ongoing for quite a while here, and maybe flaring up a little bit this week too. That's what they look like in cross section. So the shallow earthquakes in the magma are here. There is those deeper ones. The Pahala ones are deep and off to the side over there. So from the summit Uikahuna, we've seen over the last 2 weeks building inflation. It's about 10 microradians on that signal. And at Sand Hill, we've also had in the last week about 10 microradians as well, continuing a pattern for the last couple of weeks of inflation, both in that South Caldera and Southwest Rift Connector areas. The earthquake counts for the last month show that this recent spike on Sunday matches the previous events after the main pulse of the January 31st intrusion. We had a slowdown and it built back up, and so you can see it's pulsing now, and this is building more pressure underground slowly but surely. Here's how it fits in the context of the last year and 5 years. So we're really recovering from that event still. In our GPS, we see that the north and south across caldera has been continuing extending. Sometimes it slows down when the South Caldera and the Southwest Rift Connector areas are taking more magma. But it still seems to be following that same pattern, whereas at Pu'u'o, we're still seeing contraction and no movement in the East Rift Zone. On Mauna Loa, earthquake rates are quite low, earthquakes per day. Some days have nothing at all. And over the last month, they've been slightly shallower. But that's it for Hawaiian Volcano Summary this week. So we'll move on to quickly looking at our hazards, which in a national park, all the bars have been in the green all day. And even if there was some gas coming out, you'd imagine that the weather, lots of rain helps clear the air and dissolves that gas and kind of washes out the air there. So everything's in the green, no concerns today. But the volcano is still putting out, the most recent measurement was 60 tons of SO2 per day. That was a week ago or so, which if you're nearby in national park or downwind areas, and if you're sensitive, that could be something to be aware of. We'll move on from that hazard summary there to add a little bit more to our monitoring. So we do have the USGS weekly update from this past Tuesday. There's nothing novel in here or really that new. Low-level seismicity continues beneath the summit in the southwest rift zone. Ground information rates remain low. This may get updated next week, perhaps, if that increase keeps going. They do note slightly elevated rates of earthquakes, but well below those during a January-February intrusion or prior to recent eruptions. Same, more or less, depths. There's our SO2 marker from March 27th. And on a rift zone, no unusual activity along the east rift zone. Southwest rift zone is still showing that seismicity. That's the weekly update from USGS. I thought I'd come in and show you the tilt first, not because there's anything super unusual there, except for if we go to Pu'o'o, sometimes this comes up. There's a signal from Pu'o'o showing a little bit of an increase here in this blue line, which is often what we see with rain, lots of water weighing down the ground that actually makes the ground physically tilt. And the tilt meter is measuring that, but in this case, it's tilt not from a volcanic cause. So we don't, it's worth showing that to show how those look sometimes, maybe what's happening there. You can see started yesterday on this particular instrument. So when we go to our GPS very quickly, we can note that there are some of these areas that are showing a little bit more increase in recent days, similar trends, but maybe like increasing a little bit. But when we have this much weather, sometimes these GPS signals get extra corrections and they might be a little bit more erroneous to start in our initial values. This one, for example, you might believe that it maybe is skying upwards, but I wouldn't be so sure yet until we have a few days go by and have this corrected and cleaned up here. Still, the recent trends seem to continue everywhere. Everything is moving similar to as it was. It's probably more useful to turn to the mounts image. So there's a new image released from the INSAR satellite radar measurement system here. So here is the image from March 28th, going 12 days back to the 16th of March. So in this image, what you can see is two centers of inflation. That's here in the center, right? Underneath this down drop block area, maybe the crater itself is kind of funny to imagine what's happening here with a cooling lava lake, probably distorting the signal. But underneath Kahuku crater here a little bit as well, as you can see this week. Then you see this division. Then you see the second area build up over here in this southwest rift connector area, right? The South Caldera area in particular, right? And here in this particular snapshot is not showing quite as much, right? More focus this week. So I'll show you the previous iteration, the 12 days before that is this. So still some areas of build up there and there, but more of this connection in between of them. And so let's flip it back and forth here. Most recent 12-day period and the one previous to that back there. I know the colors are all different, but focusing on here, for example, to start, looking at that high Mauna Loa area, you can see it's still there, just a little bit bleeding more. And then next, focusing down here. I'll flip it in once again. You can see it's still there. It's just bleeding more and different color, different part of that color cycle is what's plotting there too. So it makes it a little bit different to look at. So similar to before, we're always in a lag, right? That goes to the 28th. So that's the most recent we'll get, about a week old or so. And there we have it, continued build up under the summit and southwest connector area. So we'll go to our earthquakes map, look at our recent earthquakes. This is showing the last 2 days, and once again, colored by depth. So you see all Pahala earthquakes are like deep down in here. There is one south flank of Mauna Loa earthquake here. This is a 2.1 at 6 miles down. So just by itself, an adjustment of Mauna Loa. Another deep background earthquake here north of Mauna Kea near Kohala. And then within the Kilauea zone, we have our earthquakes we were just describing. South flank one is still going off a little bit, and its concentration here in that southwest rift connector area. just within the last 2 days, you can see the clustering is more so in the south caldera, but still showing that slightly down rift activity as well. So this is the colored by depth. Let's see if we can pull it back here and show you the last 2 weeks in full. And it'll populate this a little bit further. And you can see how there really has been extra clustering down here in the south caldera area in the last 2 weeks. And still some stuff happening, but not as much. And all the way to here, still some adjustments going on. Okay. So last 2 weeks there. Going to our traditional USGS map for the mainland, you can see that as well here. And this one, I have it sorted by magnitude. So I just want to point out that the largest event was yesterday. There was a 2.2 at 1 mile down. There was a 2.0 today, half mile down or so. But that's about the highlight of the earthquakes around now. And that's really all I have to share about Kilauea today. I wanted to make sure we have some extra time to talk about the events of the past. We quickly touched base on Mauna Loa. So Mauna Loa also has its monthly report out, came out today. And not really any news there either. Very slight inflationary trend as the volcano recovers from the 2022 eruption and magma replenishes a reservoir system. Otherwise, nothing unusual. And in this update, they're also noting nothing unusual with Hualalai, nothing unusual with Haleakala, nothing unusual with Mauna Kea or Kamaehua Kanaloa. These are all volcanoes that USGS HVO monitors. Right? So that is the Mauna Loa report from USGS. The summit tilt on Mauna Loa is still showing a little bit of this wiggle, a little bit of variation, and it is likely in response to that southwest flank of Kilauea as well, since that allows the southeast flank of Mauna Loa to move, and that affects the summit and how much things can build up there. Here's our depth versus time for the last month on Mauna Loa. So over the last week, all the earthquakes have been fairly shallow. Those ones were happening a little deeper earlier in the month seem to have tailed off a little bit, but it's all happening at such low rates that it's not anything except just a curiosity at this point, honestly. There's earthquake rates for the last month showing those. Here's that little bit of extra activity right there, but it's still at most 3 earthquakes per day. So really not a whole lot going on there, but it makes a tiny little bump, earthquakes per week over there compared to what we've had recently. It's still been really quiet on Mauna Loa. And for the last 5 years, here is really the big picture, really, really quiet on Mauna Loa compared to build up to the eruption, intrusions, eruption itself, and here we are, extra quiet since then. So a few maps of the last week, last month, and the last year on Mauna Loa Summit. There were some weeks back in 2022, we showed a one week map, and you'd have way more earthquakes than we see on this 1 year map right here. So it's really been slow. Okay, so there is Volcano Watch this week. Today's article I thought was really interesting. This is STEM and suction solutions at HVO. So this is an article written by field tech engineer Stephen Fouquet. And the long and short of it is they have sometimes storms come through and they'll flood the tilt meter borehole with water. The tilt meter sits inside of that hole and some sand, but it can all get waterlogged and that can affect the data quality. So they say that they normally, when they're replacing a tilt meter, they have this vacuum that will suck out all that sand from there. And when the sand was all wet, their vacuum wasn't strong enough, not enough suction to pull it out. So using some STEM approach, engineering, and thinking about the science of it, they then designed this double vacuum system right here, right, by engineering this little junction box where both hoses go in, and they can have the suction of both vacuums come out this one hose, and this is what goes down their borehole right there. So pretty cool, and I'll leave it at that. The rest of the article is posted. You can check that out if you want to see more about that, but we've heard about those instruments getting flooded before and then having to go and maintain it. So it's cool to see exactly what kind of innovation that might actually take, right? And it's a little bit of Puna style in there too, right? With some extra STEM added in. So that's Volcano Watch this week. there are a few community news items to share with you guys. International Park, they are having single lane entry starting on Monday around April 8th. For about 2 weeks, they're going to close that right-hand lane, inbound lane, to allow contractor activities and work on an entrance station right there. So it's going to be extra slow getting in the park with only one booth to go through. Keep that in mind for the 2 weeks from Monday. Pardon me. All right, so that's item number 1. Item number 2, they have updated their closure of the tree molds and access road to include this road over here, this dirt road through the forest for construction vehicles only. It connects to the horse corral. And they have kept this road closed since April 3rd, and they've updated this as well. So that's the area on, this is the Mauna Loa road, goes towards Kipukaki, Kipukapua'ulu Bird Park area, and up the south side of Mauna Loa as well. And the last thing is also April 8th, dismantling of former Jogger Museum and USGS operative facilities will begin. So that's also coming up on this coming Monday, and they're making a formal announcement that they are dismantling exterior walls and roofs beginning on Monday, continuing for the next several months. Right, and the restrooms at Uikahuna were temporarily closed for the duration of the project. Portable restrooms will be available and ranger programs will continue. So that's the community corner right there from the national park. We did have a Volcano Watch article last week, which was the first half of that 1868 event. So the second half was put out in 2018 here, and we're going to talk in much more detail about this, but this is the companion piece to what happened in 1868. So I'll just flash it on here in case anyone really wants to find an article and date and go look it up, but we'll really incorporate this into our 1868 talk coming up here. So I'll take a brief pause here and let the guys chat a bit and see if I can stop wheezing for a second here. Oh, you, Dane.
All right. So I assume we're at the midway point, or it seems like that, huh? All right. So yeah, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. We rely on viewers like you to help get this information out there. The likes, the subscriptions, the shares, all that stuff really does help. I know all the YouTubers say it, but it does with the YouTube side of things and the Facebook side of things. So we appreciate everybody that's helping out in that regard. We also been doing a donation drive. I think we'll bring on Lou from Two Pineapples and talk about that a little bit. Hey, Lou.
Hey, how's it going?
All right. So yeah, we've been doing the donation drive, coming to the end of it. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we have had a very successful couple weeks here. Our Sunday is our last day officially of the drive. We'll talk about that at the end of the program tonight. It's been great. We've had so much support. We really appreciate it. Like Dane said, hit that thumbs up. If you haven't noticed, we're dropping the day before or so some posts around on Facebook in our community tab here on HVary on YouTube. Get in there, hit that thumbs up on there, support us, spread the word. Gives everybody a chance, a little extra heads up just in case you forget. There's a lot going on all the time with everybody. So anytime that you spend with us, we truly appreciate it. If you didn't catch us, Dane and I were live. I was up at the Caldera. Dane was remote running the production. In the background, we were talking about HVary and the different programs that it's all being run behind the scenes that not everybody really sees. So that was on Friday. If you want to check that out, maybe we'll drop that link in there in a little bit. You guys can check that out. That was a fun one. We were up there for what, about an hour?
Yep.
A little over an hour. Yeah. So that was fun. We actually had one clear day because we've been getting soaked ever since. So it was good to get that out. Yeah.
It's hard to follow up on when it's soaking rain outside afterwards. So we'll try to do something else later, but not tomorrow.
Not tomorrow. It was tentative. We know that everything right now is tentative to the rain, right? I mean, we can only do so much when it's pouring.
All right. Well, thank you. And I think we'll come bring you back on later and we'll go back over the donation drive a little bit more. Appreciate it, Lou. All right. Oh, we do want to do some thank yous as well. We had a donation come through from Scudget Ed. It's $20. Says mahalo, Phil and Dane crew. Looking forward to the show. Appreciate the support there. We also do want to recognize the Puna Strong and Kilauea recovery grants for the Hawaii County, helping support our operations and everything that we're doing here and trying to get off the ground. So we appreciate their support as well. Did have a question for the first part, if you want to take that now, Phil. Phil? You're muted.
Yes,
Sorry.
sure. I guess I'm muted. Sorry about that.
All right. So, question from Dennis asks, I noticed an odd spike on the tilt. It didn't look like a stair step on the EQ. Do we know what happened there?
Okay, let's see. Which tilt meter is he referring to?
It's a good question.
Yeah, if it's this one at Puo'o, then that's that rain signal right there. It looks a little bit funny, right? Let's see if I can find anything else. When we see a little spike like this, that's usually an earthquake nearby.
That looks
Maybe
like
this
a
one.
stair step to me on Pu'u'o. I'm just going over them.
Right. This is the deflation inflation cycles, and an earthquake spike superimposed upon it right there. And that's really the most exciting thing there is. So I believe that's the best I could at least pose a discussion of that. So, and if you notice that signal is localized to just one station, that's one of the clues. It's not regional and persistent, right? Sometimes you can get that if the rainstorm is big enough, but it usually affects instruments slightly differently in different places too. So you do get some weird stuff happening.
All right. Yeah, I think that does it for questions for right now. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. I know today's Merry Monarch, so it's hard to compete with, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.
Yeah, and if you're watching us on a replay, that's just as good. We appreciate that as well. So we'll mix it up here. Next will be our mix of our Volcano Awareness presentation and our own research on 1868 earthquakes and eruptions. But what we'll do is I'll play some segments of the talk that was given by Katie Milliken and what happened in 1868. And then we'll break in and add context to that. But I will let her take it to start here. And here we go.
The eruption in 1868 occurred before the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory was founded, and it occurred at the forefront of when, well, there were Westerners arrived in Hawaii and written documentation was happening, but it's not super detailed, and so we're having to piece together this story. But we're doing that so that we can learn what potentially could happen in the future. So in 1868, what was life in Hawaii like? So Hawaii was still a monarchy, and King Kamehameha V was his reign at that time. At that time, there had been about a century of Western contact. So Hawaii was definitely in this mode of change. Let's see, over a decade prior to 1868, there was the Great Mahele, which changed how land was kind of distributed and owned locally. And then in 1850, there was a change that allowed foreigners to buy land. So there was an increase in a growing Western population here in Hawaii. And part of that was also related to the sugarcane plantations that were growing at that time and the arrival of laborers to work at those sugarcane plantations. I did find a census from 1866, and at that time there were about 62,000 people living in the whole state of Hawaii, so less than the population of the island of Hawaii right now. And at that time, it was still predominantly Native Hawaiians, so 58,000 Native Hawaiians and just 4,000 non-Native Hawaiians. And here on the island of Hawaii, there were 20,000 people. Interestingly, when I was looking through the newspapers, tourism was definitely already a thing. So here's an advertisement for the Volcano House. They're calling for people to come visit the Volcano House, stay and see the eruption. And then here's a photo of the Volcano House in 1868 on the bottom here. And then the photo on the right is of kind of the arrivals and departures at Honolulu. So at that time, travel between the islands was via steamship. So there were several different ones that ran through the islands, but news took a few days because you had to travel between the islands. So now I'm going to...
That's my cue to break in here. So yeah, that's the first intro segment there. So let me get on screen here the outline that we'll be using for today. So let me switch it back. And here we go. Let's do that. All right. So this is my interpretive sequence of events for 1868, right? So I put it into 5 different phases here. Phase 1, March 27th, 28th. That's the beginning of the whole thing. Mauna Loa summit eruption, followed by a southwest rift intrusion in Mauna Loa, and a magnitude 7.1 in Kaʻū, right? That happens area 1, that's right here. Then April 2nd, a lot of stuff happens with that 7.9 earthquake. Landslides, tsunami being the highlights of that, right? That epicenter is thought to have been right around here. And this image in the background is thought to show possibly the maximum extent of how much of the island moved at one time during that 7.9 earthquake right there. Phase 3, April 2nd to 4th, right? There's a little bit of ambiguity. We'll dive into that a little bit. But in response to this earthquake, perhaps immediately, perhaps with some delay, there was 2 eruptions on Kilauea, one at Kilauea Iki, and one on the Southwest Rift. That's 3 eruptions so far, or it's the weekend. And at the same time, Hale Mount starts to drain at the summit, right? That's up here. Phase 4, this is perhaps the mystery phase here that has not been described very explicitly previously. This is where I got lost in the rabbit hole a little bit because a lot of people don't mention this at all. But it appears that there was a second earthquake, or a third one really, a second earthquake on Kilauea there, about a magnitude 7 of the south flank, and perhaps an East Rift Zone intrusion as well. Now, the details are very spotty back there, but so this might be our most question mark one, but something happens there, and in most accounts, you see this and this all lumped together as one big thing, and no mention of this at all. And finally, the 5th phase, the actual eruption in Kaʻū on a southwest rift. That was April 7th to 11th. That's our 4th eruption. That's the one that made it all the way to the ocean very quickly, ocean entry and all that destruction. And that's mostly people talk about is that phase of the activity there. So the rest of it's a little bit harder to untangle, but that is the beginning of it. So to start off, our phase 1, March 27th, there was a short eruption around Mauna Loa summit and to the southwest, somewhere in here. It was seen from Kawaihai, it was seen from Kona, it was seen from some areas of Kaʻū. Did not last very long. Then there was an intrusion that followed that. Katie will talk about the evidence for both those things. And finally, March 28th, after the earthquakes had begun, as magma was intruding into the southwest rift, it sets off a flank earthquake of 7.1, right? And lots of aftershocks that follow it as well, just from that initial one, right? So as you imagine, happened on Kilauea in 2018. Once that flank moves, because of your magma intruding, then a magma can intrude even further and go even further down the rift, and that can cause more effects, and that's kind of what we're looking at there. So phase 1, let's get into that here next, and I'll let Katie take it away.
Start walking through those events. And on March 27th in 1868, there was a very brief summit eruption. So this painting is not of that event. This painting is of likely of the 1880 Mauna Loa eruption, but I just wanted to give kind of an idea of what it might have looked like to people at the coast. So here you can see this is a view from Hilo, and the ocean is here, and then there's the profile of Mauna Loa, and you can see that there's a plume up here of volcanic gas and maybe some fog being transported by the wind. So on March 27th, Reverend Paris, who was in Kona, he wrote, "We had a glorious sight from our veranda, a new eruption on Mauna Loa. About 20 minutes after 6 o'clock a.m., we discovered from the summit of the mountain an immense cloud of smoke. This continued to increase, extending south as it appeared to us. At night, we watched, expecting to see a great river of fire, but no, all was dark and still. When the stars came out, all was clear and bright as usual. So what do we have from this? We have a start time for the eruption, just about 20 minutes after 6 o'clock a.m., and we can also get from his observations that the eruption was over by nightfall because they didn't see a glow. Even though it was clear, the stars were out, they did not see a glow. And then Lyman, who was living here in Kaʻū, he wrote, an eruption broke out on Mauna Loa, a little to the southwest of the summit, about 6 o'clock last Friday morning, without any forewarning. About 7 o'clock, we began to hear a roaring sound, which grew louder and louder until the air seemed to tremble with the incessant roar of the volcano. But finally it subsided and ceased entirely about 8 o'clock. So he gives us an idea, even more so, of the time frame, that it was, let's see, about 6 o'clock and maybe over by even 8 o'clock. So very, very brief. And he also says that the eruption started without forewarning. So at this time, they were pretty astute observers, and they, if they were feeling earthquakes, they were often kind of conjecturing that maybe there would be an eruption soon. But he's saying that maybe there wasn't a forewarning, so maybe there weren't any earthquakes before this eruption started. So the eruption was brief, and after it ended, there was a period of several days of very intense earthquakes. Here, felt in Kaʻū, felt around the whole island, actually. And one of them was really intense enough to be felt as far away as Kauai. So let's see, Lyman, he was here in Kaʻū. He says, about noon, we began to feel slight earthquakes, and during the night they were frequent, every minute or two. Though very slight, they were sufficient to prevent sleep. After sunrise, Saturday morning, the 28th, the shocks began to harden. They increased in violence until between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when there occurred the hardest of all, with 3 shocks, which lasted about a minute. The swaying motion was so great that it was hard to stand up. The rest of the day, the shocks were not very severe. Saturday night, the shocks were very frequent and severe. The next morning, Sunday, a line of smoke had advanced about 15 miles since the morning towards Captain Brown's house in Kahuku. So during this time period, there were, we're learning near constant earthquakes. Some of them were so extreme, the shaking, that people couldn't stand up. And then Cone, who was in Hilo, he wrote, on the 27th of March, slight and repeated shocks of earthquakes were felt. On the 28th, these shocks became more frequent and more energetic, extending to Hilo, Kona, probably to all parts of the island. All of Kaʻū was startled by heavy explosions and roarings, as of a tempest from the mountain. The mountain was rent apparently from near the summit crater, halfway down its southern slope, and jets of steam and smoke went up from many points. So these earthquakes caused a lot of damage. This photo you can see is of a church that fell. I think this one was in Waiuhinu. And actually, later on, we'll learn that nearly all the stone structures were destroyed during these earthquakes. But the interesting part of these observations is, the near continuous earthquakes, and then also the line of smoke that they observed down the mountain slope. So what was probably occurring now, we know, was an intrusion. So an intrusion is when magma is working its way beneath the surface, and as it does so, it has to break rock and make room. And so it was probably doing that, intruding in from the summit region into the southwest rift zone. And there were probably cracks forming and some steam being released, and that was that column of smoke and material that they were observing down the slope.
All right, so we're back. And push that. All right. So that was our first phase there. Summit eruption, Southwest Rift intrusion, Kaʻū earthquake. I wanted to add a little bit more. She showed a picture of the stone church that fell over. That was actually the April 2nd earthquake, that next phase that knocked things over. So maybe it's worth diving into a little bit that there was a lot of damage during that first earthquake, but it wasn't quite as bad as the second one, right? So, but 7.1 is still massive. So lots of damage. So let's show you guys a little bit of the evidence for that. And I'll start off with earthquake files compilation from UH that has translations of lots of the Hawaiian papers. but I'm not going to read every single thing, of course. I have to kind of filter through a little bit here, but I'll start off with this one over here, which is an article from Kanupepa Kuakoa, April 11th, 1868 here. And here is what they say. Right, the editor is compiling all the letters here. There have been 5 or 6 letters sent to this office from Kaʻū Konan Kohala, Hawaii, and from Waihe'e and Lahaina, Maui. In Kaʻū, they report seeing the eruption began in Mauna Loa, the steam that she described. The same from Kona. And here is the earthquake parts that I want to read about, damage from that first earthquake, that first 7.1. On the 28th of March, the earthquake stirred with great strength. The tremors reverberated and pounded us. Some were bigger than others, and some were smaller. But due to the rapid succession, a foreigner here in Kona, Kake Kealoha, fell down and remained on the ground for a few minutes. The next day, the 29th, the shaking continued with great trembling. However, on the 28th, it was heard far and wide that the sacred cliff of the chiefs collapsed, the sacred cliff of Keoa. The landslide started from Kalepeamoa and went on to the cliff of Ki'i and all the way to the cliff above the town of Kalakakua. Dusty haze hangs in the air today, along with smoke from burning lava. Some people made a wrong assumption that lava had emerged down here to shore and loudly shouted, "Lava erupted, lava erupted." Kona was obscured. We'll break in here and just say, even back then, they were having to deal with this fake news, so to speak, right? Misinformation has always been an issue. So back to it here. All the rocks and cliffs of our shores have tumbled and broken. The old folks think it is due to the force of the eruption. Perhaps this is true, but it was shown in geography that this is due to the contained steam. Back then, they thought that volcanoes erupted because of contained steam. It was also heard that rock walls of Kona tumbled, and merchants of that area were startled by the astonishing sight that has not been seen before. Here's an important part of the letter from Kaʻū about the earthquake. From the night of the 27th, there was a huge tremor in Kaʻū. Some house lots were destroyed, and some people suffered losses. A solid part of the famous cliff of Pohina cracked open, and some of the native residents worried that this crisis would land on all of them. According to some news, it has been confirmed, Kaʻū was a place of the greatest tremors because it is a district closest to the pit of Pele. See, once again, they believe Mauna Loa and Kilauea are linked in this era. The rock house of Captain Brown and Kahuku collapsed, and the family barely escaped. First earthquake. The chimney of Mr. Pogue's store fell a little bit. The next Sunday, the 29th, Reverend J.F. Pogue met with his brethren beneath the shade of the kukui tree. That's what the English newspaper of the government has reported, due to the fear that the church would soon fall. It hadn't fallen yet, but it was already looking like it was going to, before a 7.9 hit. It was also reported in that paper that there were 300 tremors that struck Hawaii. If so, that is truly a reason for some of the solid cliffs collapse, like the observations by people who wrote down their thoughts. They note here, this is a little curious. I'm not sure where this comes, but we've heard again, when a whaling ship was sailing outside of Hamakua, the ship was broken into pieces and the cliff peaks were seen collapsing. At Kawaihae on Thursday evening, the earth shook 3 times due to the earthquake as well. So the ship's curious to me. Was it sailing really close to the cliff and some rocks fell on it? Was it close to shore, got hit by some wave? Was there some tsunami action going on? Or was it just something completely unrelated? Hard to say there as far as the ship. That's a little curious on that one. Right? But what you can see, the point of this is that there was plenty of damage happening early on before that 7.9 earthquake occurs that is causing houses to collapse and churches to be abandoned and deserted as well. So let's see if I can find the other account. There's another account in here that has that opening sequence as well. It might be this one here from Kealaua, May 1st, 1968. Yeah, so here they note the first eruption on March the 27th, with smoke seen rising from the summit. And in the earthquakes, there were a great rock slide at the sacred cliff of Kewa at the Kalakakua Harbor, the cliff of Po'ohina and Kaʻū, the cliff of Keaho and Puna, the cliffs of Hamakua, and the steep rising cliffs of all the island of Hawaii. Right, so we're talking about Keaho, that's the southwest part of Kilauea area, or maybe south central. Keaho area having collapses at that point too as well. So I thought I'd show you a different one here. This is from the descendants of Captain Robert Brown. Robert Brown was the landowner. Well, the fissure opened up behind his house eventually. And this is from his daughter, Annie Brown Spencer, right, who recounted lots of this first phase in good detail here. So March 28th, today's been a day of terror. We had a number of earthquakes during the night. From daybreak from when I awoke until 2 p.m., there were 97. At 20 minutes of 2, I was over at Charlotte's when it was a most terrific shock. We all rushed out of doors. After half an hour or so, I went over to the house. And then with Charlie, went up to Mr. Pogue's. They were all out under the trees, and there they remained until 4 p.m. when we all went to Kauko's. Here we are, and the earth is trembling every now and then, and there's a heavy shock of earthquake. Mr. Pogue, Charlotte, and Nelson came out on horseback, the rest of us on our feet. Mr. Pogue returned, however. At 7 a.m., I noticed the natives picking up Pele's hair. There are great quantities of it on the leeward side of Kilauea. But they're actually talking about being in Kaʻū, right? She's seen it in Kilauea, and she's seeing it falling on March 29th, and Kaʻū is from the summit eruption, when blowing lava over towards her. I picked up a bunch and tied it and labeled it for my cabinet, thinking in future times would be a memento of this exciting time. She later comes back and adds notes to her diary here as well. The cook was pouring a glass of water when there came a heavy shock. He stopped and stood there while we got up in a hurry and ran out the back porch. Charlie followed, trying to calm my terror. Charlie is her husband there. So they talk about how all kinds of stuff was falling about, books, vases, dishes. Charlie was standing in our front veranda. A shock came and he saw our cemented walk and front wall rise and fall in waves. They were full of cracks and seams. Houses were moved off their foundations several feet. Charlotte's was, but I forget the exact number. The pool house, which was a 2-story building, 30 by 30 feet, was moved westerly 6 feet. Charlie came over immediately. It was reported the Pogues were in trouble. Someone was dead. So Charlie and I went up. We found them almost paralyzed with terror. One of the girls was almost in a state of collapse. We moved from Waiohino because of the hills around us and fear of the falling rocks. That was the 28th. That was just a very, very first day. Really, the day before the 27th is when the lava starts at the summit. The 28th, it starts moving down the intrusion, and the earthquakes begin there. And the 29th, at Kauko's, we had a dreadful night. The number of times we started up thinking the house would be down on our heads. Mr. Pogue and the girls went up to Waiohino at 7 a.m. The rest of us remained down here. Earthquakes follow earthquake with an intermission of from 10 to 30 minutes. We all feel worn out, but there is no prospect of their stopping for some time to come. They knew that there was a connection between earthquakes and eruptions, and they note, Volcano Kilauea was not burning much at the time, so they thought that there was no relief in sight for the earthquakes, unless there was a big eruption. We all sleep on a veranda. We heard from Kahuku. The house is in ruins, and the family are all living in one of the servants' houses. Poor mother was terribly nervous, but kept up bravely. The flow is reported on the mountains. March 30th, earthquakes still continue, but much diminished. Then lots of that, she's running a bunch of errands. We passed a rather quiet night, only a few shocks and those slight ones. The 31st, quite a number of shocks, but slight ones. It's very tiresome and I long to be in quietness once more. I read a good deal and passed the time. Charlie had a headache all day, but went to Waiohino. More errands, terrible earthquakes in Kona. People were free to remain in their houses. April 1st, we're building up to the big one. Last night, the shocks were many and hard, and consequently, our rest was much broken. A number of times we started up to rush out of doors, but did not. After breakfast, drove to Waiohino. One of the horses balked. When I say drove, right, this is a carriage you're driving, right? One of the horses balked, and I got out and walked in. Had three earthquakes while I was in Waiohino. Today, it's been pretty quiet. God only knows how long that will last. There's not any flow as of yet, and I suppose we shall not have settled times until the lava starts flowing. I hope we all have a quiet night's rest. Charlotte talks about we're going to Kahuku tomorrow. I think we'll drive out and get some books. So then they have breakfast. They walk to Kahuku. All the roads were much shattered. Everyone was pleased to see us return home. And then finally on the 2nd, 20 minutes to 4 is when that big 7.9 occurs. So that's the sequence there. There are some other accounts I found just to show you guys a little bit of what some of the source material looks like. This is a Pacific Commercial Advertiser of May 9th, 1868. It was published weekly back then out of Honolulu. And here's a front page column on the events happening in Puna and Kaʻū. But they're basically playing a game of telephone. Everyone's writing letters. And by this early phase, this is why this is not the one, but the accounts I read you that are dated that talk about what happened before April 2nd are really valuable and few and far between. And that really shows how much was going on there, because what happens later, once the 7.9 happens, no one can tell what fell over when anymore. Did it fall over during a first earthquake or in a second one? And now you start having this jumble of information, and letters start coming in. They publish once a week. Earthquakes were only a few days apart. So that's where the confusion really begins right there. So I won't get into this here quite yet. I will, at this point, just recount our sequence. Pull that back here and iterate to the next one here. The next one in our sequence, number 2, is a 7.9 Great Kaʻū Earthquake. That landslide that follows, that landslide occurred at present-day Wood Valley. Back then it's called Kilauea. And there are various reports of it being a landslide or a mud flow. We'll dive into that a little bit too. But in those days, almost everyone is calling it a mud flow. And today they're backing off a little bit on that. But I can tell you it's probably a little bit of both, really. Right? So Kaʻū earthquake, landslide, and then the tsunami is what killed most people. Died of the tsunami. Massive tsunami along the southern coast there. All kinds of damage and houses lost there. So I will let... Go ahead.
Yeah, before we jump in on that, just some thoughts on where we are so far. Besides just ignoring some of the crazy stuff like the ship, like I just don't believe something else happened type of thing. But just the stuff that's not getting reported or getting glanced over, where they're like, there was a strong earthquake, but it's not one of the big earthquakes, right? And it's like, oh, they're happening all the time. So it's like, we know what an eruption sequence feels like, hundreds, thousands of earthquakes, but usually those are small. It seems like they're talking about, things that they could feel. So it's like when they're saying every 10 to 20 minutes or every half hour, I'm like, you're probably getting like a 5.0 to
it's an aftershock sequence,
make it notable. Right.
You get for every 7 you get, you're going to get maybe like 10 that follow it and like 100 5s. And, we've seen that too, right?
Right.
We're still getting earthquakes down in South Flank from 2018 a little bit, right? And we will see that later that earthquakes of this that are linked to this event have said to still be continuing. The rate of aftershocks follow the pattern for 150 years after that. So it was really a massive event. We'll get into that a little bit later too.
All right.
So yeah, pretty crazy stuff happening so far. And the April 2nd is, really from this point on, everything becomes chaos. And as you might imagine, if there's a magnitude 8-ish earthquake happening on island here. So let me pull it back to Katie and let her continue.
And this kind of culminated in the largest earthquake that was ever recorded, or in recorded history here in Hawaii. There's no instrument recordings of this event, but the largest earthquake in Hawaii on April 2nd. So we've kind of pieced together from these reports that it was probably a magnitude 7.9. And Cone and Hilo wrote, at 4 p.m. on the 2nd of April, an event occurred which defies description. Such a convulsion has no parallel in the memory, the history, or the traditions of the Hawaiian Islands. The shock was awful. The crust of the earth rose and sunk like the sea in a storm. The shattering of buildings, crash of furniture, glass, and earthenware, the falling of walls and chimneys, made throughout the southern half of Hawaii such scenes of terror as had never been witnessed before. So this was a really devastating earthquake in Kaʻū. And one of we still use this earthquake metric today. It's called intensity, and it's based on how people are experiencing an earthquake, how they describe the shaking. And so what scientists have done is kind of gone through these observations and pieced together where the shaking was most intense. And that's how we get this kind of idea of where the epicenter of the earthquake was likely in this zone of the most intense shaking. But then extending out across the island, the shaking was still quite intense. And then it extended all the way to, actually the observations, people felt it even out on Kauai, so the farthest island, out there. But on Oahu, the shaking was intense enough to stop clocks. Now, we also know that likely what happened during this very large earthquake was that the entire south flank of the island moved. We don't really know how much, but we can kind of guess from the observations of the coast. The islands are built on the ocean floor, and there's a fault where this volcanic material, so lava flows, etc., are built on the Pacific plate. And that fault is probably what moved during this earthquake and moved out towards the southeast. And again, that was likely due to this an intrusion of magma that was happening into the southwest rift zone. And these earthquakes today are still some of the most damaging here in Hawaii. So the earthquake in 2018 was a similar mechanism, but only on Kilauea. Part of the reason that this event was so damaging in 1868 was that it moved not only Mauna Loa's south flank, but Kilauea too. So the whole southern coastline probably moved several meters. And that movement had other kind of secondary hazards. So one was a very devastating mudslide in Wood Valley. And this is kind of an artist's sketch of it. And then this is a map that was made later by Cone when he visited several months later. And they write about this mudslide that the eruption came down on both sides, leaving only one house where the school teacher was and a few people who were in it. It completely surrounded them. But they afterward crawled out over the bank of the earth and came to see us. The earth eruption swallowed up 30 persons. The next day after the eruption, on looking carefully, we saw that there had been small movements of earth along the edge of the woods. And then Cone, he visited later and he wrote, huge rocks, trees, fences are intermingled as if the top of the hill had been blasted off in a great mass. Our native guide who was present at the time of this assured us that the flow ran down like water and that it was not caused, as some have supposed, by the cracking open of ground. There was every appearance of a genuine flow. Near the center, a little island is left upon which stands a house. The actual depth of the mud is difficult to determine. It perhaps ranges from 5 to 30 feet. 31 natives were buried alive on that event, and about 1,000 head of cattle. So when Cone visited it several months later, he estimated that it was about 3 square miles in size, which is equivalent to nearly 2,000 acres. So this is a really big mudslide. And if we assume that it had an average depth of about 15 feet, the volume would be equivalent to 9 Olympic swimming-sized pools. So this was, yeah, really devastating. And then not the only, it killed 31 people, but across the islands there were landslides and rockfalls that killed several other people as well. So that movement of the whole south flank of the island also caused a tsunami that was devastating as well. And here are some observations of the tsunami. At about 5 o'clock, the sea was observed to recede, and the space between the reef and the beach was left dry in many places. The sea ebbed and flowed 13 times, and the time between each flow was between 7 and 8 minutes. In Hilo, the sea came in yesterday, 2nd of April, and washed up to and over the Waiakea Bridge, up to the King's Fish Ponds, carrying away all the walls in several places. At Punalu'u, 3 deaths from the scene. The village of Waiwahinu is all in ruins, and about 20 lives are reported as lost. The sea came in at Keoho and Apua and carried away all the houses. At Keoho, the natives escaped by running. It is feared that the natives at Apua were not so fortunate. And then several other reported deaths along the coast. So, yeah, at the same time as the mud flow, over the subsequent hours, also a tsunami, which was really devastating. In 1868, Kilauea also erupted.
Oh.
There we go.
Sorry, I guess we must have both pushed it at the same time there. Yeah, so that was a huge part of the sequence there. So let me get our sequence back up here for you guys. And there we are. Earthquake, landslide, tsunami. So there's a few other aspects of this that I wanted to get into a little bit here. A lot of it's going on. Oh, there's a lot going on there. So to start, I wanted to just talk about the intensity that she talked about, how they came about, this being a magnitude 7.9. This is a diagram she showed earlier as far as the actual mechanism that's been proposed. So maybe a little bit clearer. It's not quite so scrunched up. There's our zoomed in area of rupture proposed. And the cross section here showing Mauna Loa summit. This kind of brick pattern is that sediment on the seafloor that the lava is on top of, and that's that zone of weakness that when the volcano is trying to sprawl, that's the stuff that'll be movable, where it can slide atop of that area. And an earthquake happening during that in that interface there. So at the surface, epicenter, hypocenter, and that's where the earthquake actually occurs there. So the intensities come from mapping out by today's intensity scale where reports came from and what the intensity actually was. This is 1868. In intensity scale here, the highest value is this 11 xi. This is all 10. You see a bunch of 9s over here, 7s, 8s, all the way over here, 7s all the way to the tip of the island at Kohala, 6 over here. And in fact, it goes, you can see all the way to Oahu, they're measuring intensity of 4 over there as well. Right. So that was the one data. This is what we do know. People has reported the damage. This is the best, most accurate data we have. Then what was really important was the earthquake of 75 happened. And they were able to then compare what happened from 75 to 68. And at the time, this earthquake was measured as a 7.2 early on. This is, we'll get into it later, but it's now been revised to a 7.5 or 7.7. But let's go with the 7.2 there. And during that 7.2, the most intense shaking was this 8, right in here. It didn't actually get to a 9 or 10 or 11, right near the epicenter. It was 8, 7s, and then further on from there, right? So part of it's comparing the two things together there, right? One thing that's interesting, if you look at this, is there's this epicenter. There's this focus of activity here. Then you have this weird flare out because that's that area thought to have moved with the earthquake to involve that southeast flank of Kilauea there. But we have this very rarely mentioned earthquake that occurs possibly a couple of days later, right? That's when it comes out. So maybe I'll try to find the article, that clip that shows that. Let me see if I can. This might be kind of tricky, but maybe this one. Yes, that is the right one. So this is from that Pacific Commercial Advertiser, and they note here: the Great Earthquake occurred at 4 p.m. on the 2nd of April, which was followed by another of nearly equal force at 12:30 on the morning of the 4th, when the fires began to die out at Kilauea, and all the lava in the lakes in it to subside the following night. So it actually was in the paper that there was another earthquake here. And so that's one, probably the most clearly stated point right there. And I won't get into that too much since that's not the focus right now. But that's where that comes from. So when we imagine intensities here, my curiosity is, what if you were measuring intensity of 2 earthquakes combined into one map here? What would that do to your calculations, right? On the one hand, you might say, okay, well, that if there's 2 earthquakes, they each must be counting for a different area of the rupture, and it makes more sense if it were to go the big one over here, and then the next one over here, Kilauea South Flank, in response. And so some of the dynamics would work out. It's not, there's no smoking gun, right, at this point to suggest that. But there's certainly some ambiguity of how much of this area broke and slid in that earthquake all at one time, right? And it's curious to me because if you, let's say our 7.9 is calculated based on that whole thing being one big fault rupture. So if we reduce the area, then you have to then reduce the magnitude of the earthquake ultimately, if that's what it comes down to it, right? So in that case, you might say, okay, well, it might have been not quite as big as they thought originally. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, these measurements of magnitude back in the day were not very good. So even in Kalapanas, when they say this was a 7.2, that was now been bumped up to a 7.7. So it could be that we might bump our 7.9 down and bump it back up again and end up in the exact same place. And since we're kind of ballparking anyways, And 79 is a useful number to tell that if that entire south part were to move all at the same time, that's about our maximum biggest earthquake we can get, is about an 8 or so, which is not as big as the mainland where you can get 9s. It's still huge enough and destructive enough. But that's where there was some ambiguity there with this intensity story. So that's that one part. And we can then talk about some of the damage. Katie talked about some of the damage as well. Lots of the churches, all the churches falling over, everything that was rock falling over from that point on. I thought I could come back to the story here from descendant of Captain Brown and read this particular account, which is kind of striking here. So at 20 minutes of 4, there was a most frightful earthquake. It was impossible to walk. Charlotte fell coming off the steps and I on top of her. Charlie had Amy, and he fell with her. She rode down the hill while he tried to come to our assistance. The Pogues came out and we all slept under an awning. We all felt thankful it was no worse. The destruction is fearful. The church is all down. Our houses are much shattered and we have all lost much. Mr. Pogue's house is much broken, but we have much to thank God for that none of us are injured. Punalu'u and Honuapo are desolate. A tidal wave came in and swept all away. Many lives are lost. At Alualu, the stone houses are gone with their contents. God is talking in thunder tones, and we may all listen and profit by it. Today has been fearful. It was absolutely impossible to stand or walk. No words of mine can do justice. All the walls came down. There have been terrible landslides, and the earth is in constant tremor. All Wailohino have come out here, for this is the safest place. The roads are seamed and cracked. Oh, it is terrible. Mr. Pogue at about 8 o'clock prayed, and it was a very solemn time. There were a few trembling mortals out under the side of shelter, out under a slight shelter of sticks and mats. We were listening to Mr. Pogue's prayer. We had 2 shocks of earthquakes. It was very solemn. The night was comparatively quiet, and we hope that the worst is over. The volcano Mauna Loa has burst out and is very active. We hope it will flow from the mountain and so relieve the pressure of the pent-up gases that we could hear underground beneath us. Oh, God, help us. He's our only hope now. Keawehano'o came from Kilauea with his friends, reports 23 missing, 2 from Punalu'u and 21 from Honuapo, Joba's wife among them. She then notes that she had to come back and add to it because she didn't have much time to write in the middle of all that. There was so much to tell in limited space. We drove to Kahuku on that dreadful night of a second. Mother was glad to see us. We went into the poor old house. The walls were broken and cracks a foot wide in the parlor. The furniture was sliding toward the center of the floor. I managed to wrest open a bookcase and get quite a number of books out. Mother kept calling us to come out. She was afraid the walls would fall in and injure us. After our lunch, she kept urging us to go home again. We joked her on trying to get rid of us, sending us from our father's house. Poor dear mother smiled, but still urged our going, and she sent Mary in with us in place of Edith. At last, I ordered Tom Price to put the horses to, and with our books, we started back. We'd gotten to Kauko's and were sitting on a veranda looking at the books when Charlie, who was holding Amy, showing her his watch, shouted out of the house, "For God's sake, quick!" He jumped and fell, and so did Mary. Charlotte fell onto the steps and I on top of her. Charlie managed to reach us despite his many falls and dragged us away from the house, which seemed to be falling on us. We sat in the grass watching our surroundings. I noticed the house just in front of us go down as one would crush an eggshell. Stones from the walls were falling and rolling all about us. During the day, Charlie had been watching 2 whale ships lying off our coast through the spyglass. Had been hurled from the house by the terrible violence of the shock. He picked it up and stood by, his eyes fixed on the beach. Almost paralyzed with terror as I was, I noticed he removed his hat and said in a most pleading and awestruck voice, "God have mercy on those at the beach." Quickly, my mind seized the thought of tidal waves, as just before November 1867, there had been earthquakes and destructive tidal wave at St. Thomas, Virgin Islands. I asked, "Is it a tidal wave? Will it reach us?" He said afterwards he saw the water recede, then come in one tremendous breaker which swept far up the land, carrying all with it as it went out. There were smaller waves that followed. At the same time, hundreds of tons of earth were hurled from the western slope of the hill above Waiohinu, over the tops of the grove of trees into the valley below. The villages of Honuapo and Punalu'u were all swept away. Many were drowned, though as the natives are all expert swimmers, many were saved. A hill, 25 miles from us, behind which for ages a stream of water has lost itself, was hurled 4 miles inside of a minute. This is the mudslide, catching goats and cattle fleeing for their lives by the hind legs. Afterwards, they were found dead and dying. Under the mud flow, as it is popularly called, really a landslide. 30 of our work people were buried. So that's a lot of that landslide. I'll keep me as there's a lot in here, but I think it's worth sharing with you guys the intensity of this here. Ojoba was a man of wealth, according to Hawaiian ideas, and had made over his estate to Charlie, adopting him. He always called him Makua Father Joba and his wife Mama. Their pretty home at Punalu'u, a big native hut with its stores of mats, nets, camphor trunks, and household goods, was all swept away. Even a pond was destroyed. Steamers now anchor near where we had bathed and fished in times past. Oh, the sorrow and terror of that night. All night long, as the poor sorrowful natives were coming. Where is Kale? Charlie, was their cry. And soon their tale of woe and destruction was poured into his sympathetic ear, weeping and wailing until one's heart was aching. At last, a feeble voice called, "Where is my child? Where is Kale?" And Makua Joba came by, having walked 16 miles that night. Grasping Charlie's hand, he broke out in a loud wail. "Mama's gone. My father's tomb is gone. I only am left to tell you." Charlie brought the poor old man to me. I could only grasp his hand and weep too. Even now, after 33 years, my eyes fill and I choke up as I remember that night of sorrow and terror. Ojoba lived many years after, and Charlie cared for him until the end. So there's lots and lots and lots there. I don't have to keep reading the entire account there, but I'll put it on a screen here. And if anyone else wants to pause and read, you can. There's just so much that happened there, right? During that one day, the second, and I'll just leave it at that for now on this account. There are some other accounts here. Let me show this about the. Is this what I want to show? No, we'll go here next. This is about the mud flow. We'll just jump around a little bit here. So all kinds of different accounts, and starting off with the first arrivals on the scene. The force with which these streams were ejected from the hills and the speed at which they flowed is said by eyewitnesses to have been at the rate of at least a mile a minute. The rapidity was so great, even at the very extremity of the flow, that numbers of goats which were fleeing for life were overtaken by it and found a short time afterwards by Mr. Richardson, sticking by their hind legs into the mud. Out of the hole where the mud was exploded now issues a stream of clear, cool mountain water, which it is hoped will continue to flow, as it is the only stream in the district. It will be all the more acceptable as all of Mr. Richardson's cisterns have been totally destroyed by the same earthquake which produced the rivulet. So right away they see clear water coming out of the hole where the mud came out of there. And this is another account from a little later on. This I want to say is, this might be Hillebrand or Forno. Okay, so before reaching this mud flow from Reed's house, we passed two considerable streams of muddy water of a reddish yellow color emitting a strong odor of clay, such as may be perceived in potteries. Both streams have their origin in the landslide of the first valley. When we passed them again 2 days later, they had nearly disappeared. They evidently owe their origin to the drainage of the fallen mass. The mud flow is met with 3 miles from the reeds. It projects itself from the spurs of the hills 2 miles down into the plain, beginning at once with a thickness of 6 feet, which toward the middle forms a small hill, rises to 30 feet, averages 3/4 of a mile in width, and contracts towards its end. Let me skip ahead here. From this end, a long queue of boulders bears witness to this violent action of a torrent, which shot out of the mud after it was deposited, which has since perpetuated itself in a stream of some size, quite muddy and emitting the above-mentioned pottery odor when we first saw it on April 20th, but perfectly clear and inodorous when we passed it 3 days later. And they also go on to note, the surface of the mud in this lower course was rather smooth, as if it had been forced down by the agency of water. And it was still so soft that the feet sank deep into it. So this is the one account that was really telling us that actually was mud at that first moment. At least the downhill end of it was mud, catching a lot of that water that was trapped in the hillside there. Let's see here. It takes a while for the mud to harden. They mentioned about the people were trapped in the house in the middle. They were removed. So a poor woman who happened to be in it. Let's see. Just in the middle of the mud stands a native house and an island of grass and kalo, flanked by 2 trees. A poor woman who happened to be in it at the time of the outbreak escaped the awful fate which doomed the remaining members of her family who were out in the fields, and was removed from her perilous situation a few days after, when a crust had become solid enough to bear a man's weight. So they're also telling us that hardened and it dried out for anyone who came after those first few days. They weren't going to see any evidence of it having been wet anymore. That is part of this confusion that exists there. So on looking behind us, we saw the rock we were resting in was separated by the mountain by a deep crevasse, parallel to the wall and only partly visible as it extended under the dense trees. To our left, a clear, sparkling mountain stream leaped in bounding cascade over the crag, and after losing its course amid the maze of rocks, gathered itself again, flowing over the solid bedrock in a deep gorge cut in the mud. This stream had existed here before, but ere it reached half down the pali, became lost in the soil. It can easily be imagined what an amount of subsoil water must have been deposited here. Bearing this in mind, in a great depth of soil and conglomerate on a slope, as indicated by the cuts in the hillsides, there seems to be no great difficulty in explaining how such an enormous masses of earth, at first propelled horizontally through the air, hurled down the valley by the tremendous force which tore this off the side of the mountain, should have been seized by the propelling force of the now liberated subsoil water and carried in a mighty stream far beyond a place where at first they were deposited. So this initial horizontal motion, I don't have the clip of it here, but they talked about there was a house that was close to that hillside, and that mud flow went over it, and everyone there survived. So that's where they say it went horizontal, and then it caught the slope, and it went much further beyond than that, and we'll see the aftermath later on when we come to one of those other accounts. So let's see here. This is an account from a passenger on the Oddfellow, a ship offshore here. And we might come back to this a little bit later, but let's see here. What is the... So this is now back to the tsunami damage a little bit here. So this is a person that is visiting Hawaii. They note stuff in Kilauea on the 28th through the 2nd. Severe shock in Hilo, Keoho, and all villages in the neighborhood swept away. Friday the 3rd, shocks very violent in Kilauea. Fire in Kilauea Iki, the South Lake, terribly active and enlarging rapidly. Saturday the 4th, saw fire in Ho'osekapoho, could not tell whether it was lava flow or not. Sunday the 5th, made Kealakomo and Puna at daylight. The houses nearest the beach are all gone, the same at Kahuku. All slept clean at Apua. Reached Keoho Kaʻū at 7 a.m. and anchored. Found the anchorage and boat landing all right. Every building, 11 of it in all, washed away. Not a stick or stone of them left standing. Portions of the wreck washed inland over the flat about 800 feet. Heavy ohia sticks and a large spar were carried that distance. That's part one there. Where is that? In some places, the ground appeared to have sunk and the sea was flowing a fathom deep where houses formerly stood. Men who were at their work near the beach at the time of the shock said the walls of the stone buildings were thrown outward by the shock, which was so severe that they themselves were thrown off their feet. Then the sea came pouring over the rocks, which lined the shore, and they escaped being overtaken by the hardest kind of running. So let's see here. They were trying to land again. Stone Church and all the buildings near the sea are gone, and all but only 3 houses are left. Smoke is issuing from the back of Hilea. All the houses are gone, strewn inland for 600 or 800 feet. Dense clouds, and then eventually on the 7th, they note deck was covered in fine ashes. The eruption begins. So we'll leave this account here for now. And that's just a little bit more about that tsunami damage that was widespread that Katie also mentioned there. There is one other thing that I wanted to mention regarding the tsunami that's a little bit more lighthearted here. Since this is all some heavy stuff, I'm going to throw one thing in here at least. And this is, I don't know what you'd call it here, pop story of Hawaii here. But this is from the paper in 1868. I've just been told an incident that occurred at Ninole during an inundation of that place. At the time of the shock on Thursday, a man named Hulaua and his wife ran out of the house and started for the hills above. But remembering the money he had in the house, the man left his wife and returned to bring it away. Just as he entered the house, the sea broke on the shore and enveloping the building, first washed it several yards inland, then as the wave receded, swept it off to sea with him in it. Being a powerful man and one of the most expert swimmers in that region, he succeeded in wrenching off a board or rafter, and with this as a papa he'enulu surfboard, boldly struck out for the shore and landed safely with a return wave. When we consider the prodigious height of the breaker on which he rode the shore, 50, perhaps 60 feet, the feat seems almost incredible, were it not that he is now alive to attest it, as well as the people on the hillside who saw him. So the story there, yeah, I mean, maybe the more modern version I was told when I first came was he grabbed his wallet and surfed back with his wallet in his teeth. right? So I was kind of curious, like, what's going on? Could that really have happened? So there's a little aside here. I pulled up. This is from images of old Hawaii. Some images of what money looked like back in those days. And a lot of it was actually, it was still coming into being, a lot of scripts. So it could have just been regular papers from wherever they were working, sugar plantation or wherever, just, with their own currency. They started regulating things. All of these come from afterwards, 1883. So it's a few years later, some coins, but some of the paper money at the time, just so you guys can see what it might have been that this guy, possibly something along those lines, not exactly these were made afterwards, right? But something along these lines as well. So images of old Hawaii is where this comes from here. So maybe didn't actually have a wallet, but there is that original clip of the paper from 1868 of the Honolulu that surfed back the tsunami wave, right? So that is the tsunami accounts. There was quite a bit of subsidence along the shore. The shoreline sank a lot everywhere. We'll step back from that a little bit now because it's not quite clear. Did that sink during a 7.9 only, or during a 7.9 and some possibly later magnitude 7? It comes in Kilauea next, and so at this point we will turn to what's happening at Kilauea first, and then follow up with that mystery earthquake coming after that, right? So back to our outline here. Here we are. Talked about the earthquake, landslide, and tsunami. And next will be what happens at the summit here. Earthquakes at Kilauea, Kilauea Iki eruption, Southwest Rift eruption, draining of Hale Ma'u is what we'll talk about next here. So let me pull it back to Katie. And also we will be featuring Drew Downs from his talk on the Southwest Rift as relates to the 1868 eruption as well. So here they go.
So there was, if you can imagine the whole south flank of the island moving, Kilauea is going to be impacted too by those changes in pressure and movement.
There was an eruption in 1868 that happened at the summit. It's no longer exposed. It's now buried under the 1959 lava if you do the Kilauea Iki Trail. So under all that 1959 lava is actually 1868 lava that, depending on the accounts you read, either erupted April 4th or April 2nd. I think a lot of people have settled on April 4th as the actual eruption date. And this coincided with the 7.9 earthquake. And this is just a kind of a brief summary that was given by Bingham of lava appearing in one of the lateral craters, and you see where that April 2nd date comes from, on April 9th. And he was a little confused on where the eruption was actually occurring. Keanakekoi crater, which is off to the side of the main Kilauea caldera, or Kilauea Iki. It's now known that it was Kilauea Iki. But reports are confused as to the names of where it was actually taking place. But you can see Hillebrand here came through and said the bottom of Kilauea Iki, formerly covered with thick vegetation, is now floored by black lava that rose from between 6 and 10 p.m. on the 4th. But the summit's not the only part of the story. It also erupted in the Southwest Rift Zone. And it might actually be hard to see the colors there, but there is orange there, because the 1868 lavas in the Southwest Rift Zone are tiny. You can see here, this pad of lava right here is the biggest one. There's actually 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This biggest one is probably 200 by 300 yards across. They're tiny. They would have erupted in a matter of minutes. You'd be hard pressed to have an eruption of this size last more than an hour. And again, this happened on the same day as the summit and associated with that large earthquake. So there's our 1868 lava flow. And as Bingham wrote, at this time the summit was erupting, but the main crater was also collapsing. And a crack open and lava had oozed out, by no means sufficient quantity to lead to the supposition that this is the conduit by which Kilauea has emptied itself. So he's even stating here, this was a small eruption, that Kilauea was emptying itself, but the newly formed lava out there, it wasn't enough to actually account for all this magma that disappeared at the summit.
All right, got all buttons pushed here. Get us back online here. So, all right, that was the summit of Kilauea section of this. So let's recap once again here. Let's put this back on the screen. Right, look at the earthquakes that happened on Kilauea from the 2nd to the 4th. He states that the 4th is maybe the agreed upon date for those eruptions. I am not convinced personally. I think there's still some ambiguity, and I will show you why as we step through some of the other accounts of this here. So let's show you what we got here. First, we did mention already this. We did show this article from the schooner that talked about lakes in Kilauea active on the 28th. Right, we saw the earthquake on the 2nd, and then shocks continuing very violent in Kilauea. Fire in Kilauea Iki, the South Lake. She puts it on the 3rd, not quite the 4th, so there's a little confusion there as well. Enlarging rapidly. So let's leave that account there. Let's skip ahead to this account here. So this may be Hildebrand. So he actually mentions Hildebrand, saying it was a 4th at one point in time, but other points in Hildebrand's account, he says it's the 2nd as well. So it's not quite clear, and I don't know if we'll ever exactly know the truth there, but I tend to believe the 4th for the 2nd earthquake and events, right? And that's why there's confusion. And the 2nd for the 1st earthquake and events, and it probably was a little bit of both going on there. So about Kilauea Iki. Allow me to relate what I learned from Kaina, the district judge and a most intelligent Hawaiian, who resided near the volcano without interruption for the last 5 months, and whose strong nerves sustained him during a fearful catastrophe induced by the earthquakes of April 2nd. He and a Chinaman who keeps the house were the only persons who remained at Kilauea. He says that for 2 months preceding the first shock, namely from January 20th to March 27th, the crater had been unusually active, 8 lakes being in constant ebullition and frequently overflowing. During all this time, the date of its first appearance could not be ascertained exactly. There was in the northwest corner a blowhole from which, at regular intervals of a minute or less, with a roaring noise, large masses of vapor were thrown off as from a steam engine. This ceased about the 17th of March. At the same time, activity in the lakes became greatly increased, and Kaina anticipated mischief. March 27th, the first shock was perceived. 2 days later, Mr. Abram Fornander found the bottom of the crater overflowed with fresh lava and incandescent, so still active on the 29th. On Thursday, the 2nd, a few minutes past 4 p.m., a big earthquake occurred, which caused the ground around Kilauea to rock like a ship at sea. At that moment commenced fearful detonations in the crater. Large quantities of lava were thrown up to a great height. Portions of the wall tumbled in. This extraordinary commotion, accompanied with unearthly noise and swaying of the ground, continued from that day until Sunday night, April 5th. But from the 1st, the fire began to recede. It starts draining out right away. And as it's doing so, the gas is getting mixed up, it's puffing and thrown up, but it's draining immediately after that big earthquake, right? So now we know Kilauea is having intrusions of its magma from its summit into its rift zones. Also, we saw Mauna Loa started off making Kilauea do it also, basically through that big earthquake. Let's see here. On Thursday night, it was already confined to the regular lakes, and on Saturday night, it only remained in the Great South Lake, and on Sunday night, there was none at all. Pele had left Kilauea. The noises now became weaker and were separated by longer intervals. By Tuesday, quiet reigned in Kilauea, and at that point in time, lava burst out a distance of 40 miles southwest in Kahuku. And this is why some people at the time believed that the magma from Kilauea had drained through the southwest rift, popped up a little bit of lava, not enough, but kept going to Kahuku and erupted over there, despite the fact that the vent was actually a different element. Anyways, that was the idea at the time. And now we know better than that because we have better instruments and more information. But you can see how that would make sense to someone who didn't have anything beyond that at the time. This will be, so okay. April 2nd from 6 to 10 p.m. That same day is a big earthquake. Kaina observed fire in the direction of Puna, which at the time caused him to believe the lava had found a vent again in that direction, as it did in 1840. So he's looking to lower Puna, wondering, is something happening down there? Right, we know there's an intrusion. Did it go down there? but he subsequently satisfied himself that it was only reflection from the lava in Kilauea. It was not seen afterwards. So it didn't quite state it here, but lava was in Kilauea from 6 to 10 p.m. on the 2nd, is what he's also saying in a backward way right there, right? So same guy, the source, this guy Kaina, who was the, and the thing is, whoever was writing the letter, Kaina told this guy this, Kaina told this guy the same thing. They both write letters and they have different information to the editor. So who messed up the game of telephone there is hard to tell, right? So that's part of the challenge of reconstructing the data from this age, from this era. So there's that right there. Let's see here. This is not the clip I need. Let's go to this one. Yes, this is the one here. Let's get this bigger. The following from Mr. Fernander's letter will be read with great interest in this connection. So let me skip ahead. Great shock. The walls tumbled in on the south and southwest sides and the east side from the southeast upper banks to nearly the place of descent from the volcano house. The banks of the South Lake, including what was known as the cathedral, had caved in, and the lake was some 6 times larger than before. A large chasm opened in a neighborhood of the North Lake, near the lookout house running up to the woods and cutting off the Kaʻū Road entirely. Between 5 and 6 p.m., a fire was discovered to have broken out in the old Kilauea crater. This is Kilauea is what he means by that. To the east of the volcano, at the same time as the lava beds in the volcano seemed to have settled down about 100 feet as if the volcano had been tapped. So they're saying there starts to be a summit collapse at the same time as eruption of Kilauea on April 2nd between 5 and 6 p.m. It's very specific information, right? Mr. Porter attempted to visit the old crater Kilauea, but was obliged to give it up on account of the chasms and cracks continually opening and barring the way. He got sufficiently near, however, to ascertain that the old crater, which for ages has been extinct, was now all aglow with burning lava, probably drawn off from the volcano. The shocks, explosions, opening of new cracks and steam holes in all directions, threatening to isolate the volcano house, a large steam hole right in the gravel path in front of the house, and a chasm running all along the fence nearly up to the stables, and the, so to say, visible grinding of the rocks to powder by the continued action of the earthquake, admonished Mr. Porter it was time to leave for Hilo, and he left the volcano house.
Yeah, pretty crazy there, all of it. But yeah, definitely not agreement that it's the 4th that I'm seeing.
No, so we'll come to this. So I'm reading some of this because I'm going to get this a little later. Volcano. So this is the most damage reported volcano house was the steam hole and a little bit of a crack. Everywhere else, everything fell over, right? So relatively speaking, volcano didn't get it very bad at all. Volcano got hardly any shock. And that's part of the curiosity, right? You're going to say that there was all this damage. We know there was damage in Hilo from 7.9, but did the damage reach all the way to Kapoho and Puna down there as well? Or was that from the second earthquake or both together? Hard to know. I did see an account from April 2nd also that someone said I was in Puna and everything got destroyed and there was a wave there also. So I think for sure the 7.9 affected it there, but maybe it was a double whammy, right? And I'll come to that here in a little bit. So, okay, let's keep going. Here's the account from Kaya again. It's basically Kaina again. So that's the same one. Let's see here. No, this is not it either. So, okay, so that's a lot of that. When did it actually happen there? So let me come back to our sequence of events here. And with that in mind, let's look at this. So far, we know magma intruded the summit, forced its way down the southwest rift, set off a 7.1 earthquake. Magma then keeps going down the rift, pushing that flank. It sets off a 7.9 earthquake after that. That shakes all of Kilauea as well. It causes an eruption at Kilauea and an eruption in the southwest rift over here. Now, there's something I wanted to pull out here. Let's see if I can find it, which is an old volcano watch. Here we go. Old volcano watch back from 1994. Scientists were re-examining the big earthquake of 1868. Now, come into just a little piece of this, which is the relevant part. There are several published models of what caused this great earthquake. The first is simply that the whole southern side of the island, bounded by the southwest and northeast rifts of Mauna Loa, slid seaward on April 2nd. Right? A more complex model based on sequence of events between March 27th and April 2nd and on newly acquired bathymetric data offshore suggests that there were two separate landslide structures on the south flank of the island, and that each moved during a sequence of events. In this model, magnitude 7.1 earthquake on March 28th was triggered by the movement of a landslide structure by the southwest rift zone of Mauna Loa volcano, and a fault from this went all the way down to the ocean, right? This block was inferred to extend offshore at least 12 miles, was pushed seaward by the intrusion of magma. And then they say, on April 2nd, a different and much larger landslide block, consisting entirely of the south flank of Kilauea volcano, moved seaward and caused a magnitude 7.9 earthquake. This landslide is bounded by the southwest and east rift zones of Kilauea and extends offshore to the southeast, nearly 25 miles, the western end near Nali'i Point, but narrows to the east where it extends 50 miles offshore from Kapuho. In this model, the south flank moved because it was triggered by the shaking caused by the earlier magnitude 7.1 event. And the same eruption on the southwest, the small eruption on the southwest rift and ground cracks open in the same area between Kilauea and Mauna Loa. This is the key thing that you're pointing out here. Such extension across Kilauea's southwest rift zone would not be expected in the first model because the southwest rift zone was not a boundary of the proposed active block. So that's the key of it there. I won't get into any more of it than that, but hopefully you got the gist of it there. But I will add, they also don't note a third earthquake, which could have been that southern flank of Kilauea as well. And so they never quite got there with this analysis. And I wonder if it's because that piece of information was missing. Right, so let's see. So that is the story of the model there. So let me come back to my sequence. I have too many pictures here, but so the 7.1 is moving over here, right? So that pushes a 7.9. If the 7.9 really does occur over here on this side, then what's happening is it's actually causing enough movement to then cause shaking to release this somehow. It's like one pool ball hitting another ball and it knocking on, something like that, right? To actually cause a gap to exist in between the two. And that's why they don't quite favor that model. Now, if you have a second earthquake, then you could potentially put it into that. So that southwest rift eruption, that one is a little bit questionable. Did that happen right away or not? I think we can say that I would lean personally to the summit collapse began on April 2nd at Kilauea. Eruption of Kilauea began then as well, right? Now, if the summit collapse is what fed that southwest rift eruption, you have to open the summit to the southwest rift, something like that, right? And if that's the case, if you're torquing, let's say this piece of land is rotating out this way, that could open some of that gap. Then it could actually also cause some kind of pinching in the back end of it that maybe could squeeze out an eruption at Kilauea. So that could be possible. Maybe something like that combined with a collapse could be enough to create a one-day eruption only. So that might fit in there, but there's still this question of what's really going on between these two zones and why are there cracks in the middle of this thing that lava could get out of if that's exactly what happened. So that's the question there, and that's why I keep this second to fourth in there, right? So it could well be that we had Kilauea on the 2nd, and then later on the 4th, we have that second earthquake, and then we have an eruption happening down there. There are some accounts of people over here in Kaʻū looking northeast and seeing that eruption too. But once again, this being my telephone with the dates makes it not clear. It could have been the 2nd, could have been the 3rd, or could have been the 4th. It's hard to tell, right? And as you heard Drew say, that might have only been active for about an hour or so. So in any case, that fits in the story somehow within there, right? That second eruption over there. And by April 5th, lava is no longer visible at the summit. Everything drains all the way out. So that's part 3 of the sequence. And let's see if I'm ready to move on. I think I better be here. Oh, there's a couple other things as well, actually. So they mentioned that this fault block was all the way offshore. I didn't read the account earlier, but people talked about how out in the ocean, they saw bubbling and boiling before they saw a tsunami wave come. Right offshore, they saw something disturbing the water offshore, right? So that does lead you to believe, and this is where this paper, that article was sourced from, was they actually went offshore with a ship and did a side scan of the ground and saw those big blocks down there. And I said, okay, yeah, it's very possible that that rupture went all the way into the ocean. And if that's the case, the front of it would have been what got pushed upwards. That's what moved the water above it and caused a tsunami to occur. And so that people on Kaʻū shoreline actually looked off and saw out in the ocean, the bubble is coming up, and then the wave coming in, which is incredible. I've never heard anything like that before, but I can see how it could happen right there. Right, that's one part of it there. The other thing that's not quite clear, let me pull up this paper by Tim Orr. Where is it? Correcting a historical record for Kilauea volcanoes 1832, 1868, and 1877 summit eruptions. They came back through, and this is partly what's in the talk, right? So that's 1832, that's 1868. So that's where the eruption occurred in Kilauea Iki, was right there. In 1877, a little bit over here too. But of this area right here, Kilauea Iki, there is the other crater, Kahuku crater down in here, which has this historically reported date of 1877 for the eruption that occurred there. However, these guys came back in and they're examining all of this as they're doing their analysis here. And let me get to the Kahuku section here. Look at the old maps, pictures of fissures of where everything broke out, where and when, to reconstruct all of this, right? So, but come into Kilauea Iki, Kahuku crater, right here. We're unable to locate any first-hand accounts of this activity, but the date is stated definitively in Hitchcock, 1911, who wrote that Wilkes P. and his father witnessed the eruption in Kahuku crater in 1877. However, when you get to the conclusion of this, all through here, let's get all the way down to the takeaway points. No first-hand accounts of the 1877 eruption of floor of Kahuku crater could be found, so the accuracy of the long-accepted eruption date could not be verified. In addition to the 1877, eruption dates of 1868, yada yada, are also possible based on inferences from written sources. So they can only narrow down between 1865 and 1881. So there's also the chance that there was lava in Kahuku to some degree, and because there was so much other stuff going on, maybe it was missed. It's hard to believe that. The one person tried to get to Kilauea Iki couldn't get there because of all the cracks in the ground. And another account I read said hardly anyone ever goes to Kahuku because it's on that far side of the crater. All the trails, you had to like go down in the crater and come out the other side to go up there. All the trails went into the crater back then. So hardly anyone went that far. You'd be walking past the lava to go there, right? So maybe people just weren't used to going at it. So that's a big question mark as well.
And then how would you see it, the glow from Volcano House, because you're looking over glow already? So it'd be really difficult to tell that, I think, that it was erupting or anything.
So I don't know. This is an even bigger question mark, but there is this suggestion and publication that possibly 1868 erupted in Kahuku that I thought was worth a mention here as we move through this here. So yeah, I think now it's time to move forward onto our next step of our sequence. And I know this is a long presentation, but there's a lot of meat on this bone here for us to get through. So here is stage 4. What of this mystery earthquake, right? Was there a magnitude 7 on the south flank? Was there an east rift intrusion? The east rift intrusion is very, very sketchy, but you can imagine that it could happen if that were the case. If you did have a big earthquake that occurs here and torques this piece of land first without the eastern coast, then this might be the one that comes next to follow suit, right? And if that's the case, then you would expect the next migration of magma to be in the east rift zone, not the southwest rift zone. That does make sense for that to happen that way, especially if there was that third earthquake to occur. So here, I don't think I have the paper that I need open. Let me find it and stick it up here. So professional paper 1806. I have it. Oh, where is it? There it is. Okay, so now I have to get this thing open and find the 1868 section. Let's put it on here. Unsupported. Okay, well, let's do it a different way then. Let me drag. Well, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, while you're doing that, it is interesting just the accounts on the second when they're talking about, the walls caving in and the bubbling and the fire retreating. It's like, okay, so caldera collapse or partial caldera collapse, summit collapse, whatever you want to call it, 2018 looking like thing. really interesting, and the ability just to be able to get access to these areas, right? Because as you were saying earlier, it's like, oh, they thought the earthquake triggered the Southwest Rift Zone, and then the magma went all the way down in the Southwest Rift Zone and then erupted, but it wasn't in the right spot. But how would you know it was the right spot when you don't have maps like we have, or the like this data? So it's really flying blind, and you can see that with the reporting and the inconsistencies, and the stress is high, and people remember what they remember. But yeah, there's always that thing with firsthand accounts and trying to average them out to try and figure out what exactly happened here.
All right, I'm gonna force this thing to come in here. Why does it want to go? But it needs to just show up here. All right, there it is. Okay, so this is from professional paper 1806. And first look at the table here, where they note just events by date. So coming up here, 1868, April 2nd. This book is about Kilauea, so it's not talking about the Mauna Loa stuff that happens before that. Great Kaʻū Earthquake, fractures to the south flank. In this, they write 4.4, or I'm sorry, April 4th, south flank earthquake, magnitude 7 question mark. Right, so even in USGS publication that came after some other stuff, it's not integrated in all the different presentations so far. Cox, through oral communication, notes that excessive damage at Kilauea's south flank and an anomalous arrival of a second tsunami in Hilo. Right, let's restate that. Excessive damage on Kilauea's south flank and an anomalous arrival of a second tsunami in Hilo suggests that one of the strong aftershocks was beneath Kilauea. Right, and then they note collapse and eruption of Kilauea on the 8th, which must be entirely wrong. It's not even in our range of second, third, or fourth at this point, but it just goes to show you how hard this information is to nail down. And then they also note on the 8th, report of eastern craters opening and smoke in the direction of Puna. This is from a newspaper that I could not find online, so I could not find that report for you guys. But we do have the one account of, was there a fire at Kapoho that someone saw from the ship offshore? Was that possibly something? If there was an eruption, it must have been very, very short and small.
Right.
But there certainly could have been cracking and fume coming out as a result of intrusion, even if there was no eruption coming out of Lower Puna there.
Maybe it's me applying modern standards to things, but I have, since 2018, put an asterisk on boat reports because I've just seen how people will come back and be like, oh, all this stuff is happening. I'm like, bro, no, it is not. I do not. You're like, oh, but I'm on the boat and I'm looking right at it. And it's just like, you're miles off. And I've just seen that multiple times already. So I always throw it out there like, just boats are hard. You don't, unless you're really out there and doing it commonly and know what your points of reference are and stuff like that, just going with your gut, it's gonna be off. That's just what my experience is with the boats and making judgment calls from out at a distance. So I'm just throwing that out there. A lot of this stuff, history is so hard to go through and navigate. And now you're seeing a lot of the stuff that historians deal with in terms of, well, who do you believe when you have conflicting information? Can you find supporting information?
Yeah, it's easy to see how this information about the East Rift stuff would have just been easily dismissed. And I'm only bringing it out of the dustbin here because I want to consider the fact there might be this third earthquake. And if that's a third earthquake, then is there any evidence? And
right,
why would people be saying this stuff if we weren't seeing something, right? So who knows exactly? It's too late. We'll never really know. But I think the potential is there that you might have had that as part of the sequence there as well too, right? So there is text in here as well, and he does state the same thing in the text here. Let's see what it says here. He mentioned, where does he mention Cox again? Here we go. Cox concluded that 1868 earthquake aftershock sequence included a second earthquake of high magnitude, magnitude 7, beneath Kilauea's south flank, resulting in the generation of a second tsunami. So they say delay in draining and intrusion and eruption. So, but maybe that's off. Who knows, right? They note this different interpretations of the south flank in different areas of entire south flank Kilauea moving. So they are basically stating things here that are clues, but there's also some mess still in there, from what I can tell, right, from this paper. So what I found interesting is if we go to the living document that the USGS publishes. So let's see, where is this one? See if that'll come on there. Yeah, that'll go there. So this is listing all the eruptions of Kilauea. Going back in time, we can go all the way back to 1868. And here is where this April 4th as a preferred date is noted here, right? They note Great Kaʻū Quake on April 2nd, followed by an eruption in Kilauea crater. So they're saying there's a 2-day gap between those things actually happening. And I'm saying there's 2 days of earthquakes, building, and another big earthquake, and then you have all that stuff happening because of the earthquake. So either it happens in the second as a result of the first earthquake, or happens in the fourth as a result of the second earthquake. But either way, it happens right after an earthquake. There's no 2-day gap, in my opinion, happening here. So that's where else it does that. And you see, even between different USGS publications, they have the dates different. So there you have it, as why this is confusing still a little bit. So that's the little bit of Kilauea summit there. That first account that we heard from the schooner, I think the person is disembarking and coming on land, right? So she's walking up to Kilauea crater and says that the southwest part of the crater collapsed during the first earthquake, the first 7.1. Now later they saw during the 7.9 lots of the southern part of the crater collapse in the 7.9. Was there anything collapse in the 7.1? I don't know. It's hard. That's hard to pull out without further research. I didn't have enough time to dig into it any further. And if I had, I might as well submit for publication, because we're getting pretty deep in this thing here at this point.
Yeah.
So the fact that you have very little damage to the volcano house from the 7.9 itself, and then you have all those craters falling in afterwards, like what's going on with that? Is it just the location and they happen to be lucky? Who exactly knows, right? But one other thing I wanted to show here is a little bit about that collapse. Are we doing collapse yet? Or no, I guess we'll do collapse. We'll do collapse next, I think. So let's come back to our sequence. Oh yeah, we are collapse. So we'll do collapse, right? So South Flank earthquake, anomalous tsunami in Hilo, Kilauea collapse. So don't know exactly. Did it start on a 2nd? Did it start on a 4th? It probably ended by the 8th, by the sounds of it here. Right, and East Rift intrusion, if that happened, would have been, I would suspect, coincident in time with that summit collapse, as we saw in 2018. What we do know is that by the 9th, in Hilo, they report earthquakes tailing off 2 days earlier than they do in Kaʻū, right? Because Kaʻū has an eruption still happening out there and intrusion happening as well. So in Hilo, closer to the Kilauea side, they report that by the 9th, everything is done as far as earthquakes. So as far as the collapse of the crater there, let's see what I can show you guys. Where do we have it here? I'm gonna have to cycle through. Okay, that's not it. This is the earthquake again. Okay. On the 4th, in this report, the lava began to be withdrawn, and the portion which had been in a recent action subsided. So it is now 300 or 400 feet lower than it was a month before. From Volcano House, one would not readily observe the extent of the subsidence, but on going down into the part that has sunken, the extent of the change is noticed. The Old South Lake is now a hollow pit 500 feet deep with a single large cone at the bottom, surrounded by black lava rocks, but showing no fire or smoke. The result of the earthquake was it completely extinguished the fires in the crater, at least for a few days. So there's that account of the subsidence there. Here is another one. We said this before. At the same time, lava beds in the volcano seem to have settled down about 100 feet, as if the volcano had been tapped. There's that. Where is the... Oh, no, that's the wrong account there. There's lots of these accounts here. So more of Hillebrand. Begin to recede. Confine. No, that's the next one. They go on in their articles. They're right in their letters because they just keep adding to the end and more things happen there. So, all right. So Terrible rainings on April 2nd tore up the earth, opened great fissures everywhere around Kilauea, sent down thundering avalanches of rock from the high surrounding walls, and probably opened a subterranean passage for Eden's flood to the southwest. That night, Pele decamped in this underground passage, and the central area of the great crater subsided about 300 feet, leaving, or rather forming, a new black ledge of unequal width all around the crater. In some parts, the central depression left a ledge of perpendicular or beetling wall with a serrated line, but in most parts, the center sagged away gently, forming a large concave basin with an angle of 20 to 70 degrees. The surface of this concave was once the crowning or convex central portion of the crater, where ferns and ohillos have been growing for nearly 20 years. This superincumbent plateau has been depressed so quietly that the surface is very little disturbed, and the ferns and bushes are still growing in a basin 300 feet below their position on the 1st of April. Some parts, however, of this great area have been covered with fresh lava, and some ferns have been killed by the heat and gas. The black ledge passed down and across this depression about a mile, and up the ascent on the other side for half a mile onto the rim of Halemaumau. This all changed. It has gone down some 500 feet below the highest point in a black ledge, about 200 feet below the depression in the basin before mentioned. The walls have fallen on all sides, and the pit resembles a vast funnel, half-mile diameter at the top, and about 1,500 feet across the bottom. So let me show you a couple maps. We have a map from 1865 by William Bingham, right, showing
a lot like the collapse.
Cathedral, all kinds of features on the floor, but not any big crater there at all, right? And then let me show you a map from 1868. And there is that inner pit, the outer pit. Here's a cross-section showing how it goes down to the inner pit there. And it's also showing this little pad of lava over here in Kilauea from 1868. Now, it's also putting a 77 flow on here and showing something in Kankakoi, but maybe that's 77. Who knows? There's some mix-up happening here as well, but there is that collapse bit. So there was the after and the before. Go ahead, Dane.
I think you said it there as just the collapse pit. I mean, that the description, right? Instead, looking at the technical, it seems a lot more just like if you experienced 2018, the collapse that happened there, and the rubbly walls and the angles, stuff along those lines. But it's very different. But just that the collapsing of the caldera and some of those descriptions, because it's so hard to describe. So when they say like this collapse, it's like, all right, so what do you count as a collapse? Is it just some rock fall that creates a dust cloud? Is it because one of those descriptions sound like a big chunk near Volcano House had fell in? And it's just like really hard to gauge when you are using that type of non-scientific language exactly what you're talking about. Especially when people are panicked and the emotions and adrenaline's high. And then you get that, telephone game, I guess, or embellishing upon the truth that happens after time. So it's just, difficult to navigate, but I think you're getting somewhere with all this.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's still a tangle, right? I don't have like a conclusion, but I told you I lean towards this earthquake this second earthquake actually occurred. If they measure the tsunami 2 days later, they're talking about there was 13 waves. It came like every 15, 10 minutes. Like that's like a couple hours or a few hours of tsunami, not 2 days of tsunami. That's something else happened there.
Well, there's already weird stuff happening because you have, to me at least, because you have the Southwest Rift Zone and magma's there and you have an eruption there. But you also know that you have an eruption in Kilauea. So we're dealing with a little bit of a weird dynamic already that's confirmed. So then if you're to tell me that it erupts somewhere in the Middle East Rift Zone, maybe middle to lower, like the Jonica style eruption where it's like a day and then it's done, or a few hours, I can believe that. That doesn't sound, especially since if without Kilauea, I wouldn't believe it. But you already have a prime summit with all the lava lakes. You have Iki explode going off. Why couldn't it get into the rift? And that place is so poorly monitored, especially in some of those straits, that I could see it, just potentially.
A 7-9 could open everything. It could certainly open that rift. It could open both rifts together at the same time. It could, so that everything's in play. That's the idea of the whole South Flank moving together. That means both rifts open.
Right. But it technically also pinch in a certain small place of it and force magma, like a popping of a zit type of an eruption.
Yeah. I think that might have been Kilauea
on the table.
I think that could have been Kilauea right there, because that was such a small thing. It just popped up, like, you know, while the summit collapsed. So magma left one place, went to another place. It was kind of trying to go both places, and it got on an uphill side. It just got squeezed and popped up a little bit. That's how it seemed to me. So, but yeah, it's fascinating to think about all that. You know, happened 156 years ago. So we're not going to get any new witnesses coming forth to resolve this here. More than likely, unless we find some buried book somewhere or something, you know. That's kind of what we got, right? So, but interesting stuff here. And I know we're going on, and there's still a fifth part of this sequence, which is the actual eruption at the very end of all this, which is what makes most people talk about exclusively, is this part of the eruption in Kahuku. If you go to the Kahuku Extension National Park, that's what you see over there. So let's come to stage 5 here at the very bottom near Kīlauea. Our fourth eruption reaches the ocean in 3.5 hours. Mauna Loa summits collapse also. 2 summit collapses, 16 days, plus the 4 eruptions. I forgot to mention that as well. And everything ends by the 11th. That was a 5-day eruption there. So I will once again come back to Katie to let her share her segment on this eruption. And I had to put in a little extra there in the middle because she does not address that possible second earthquake at all. And so I had to do a little extra there to hopefully fill in that missing part of the record. But all right, here we go.
And then several days later, an eruption occurred here on the Southwest Rift Zone. On Tuesday afternoon, April 7th at 5 o'clock, a new crater several miles lower down and about 2 miles directly behind Captain Brown's residence burst out with a heavy roar and frightful crash. The lava stream commenced flowing rapidly down the beautiful plateau towards the farmhouse, and the inmates had barely time to escape with what clothes they had on before the houses were all surrounded and enclosed with streams of fiery lava, varying from 5 to 30 feet in depth. So here's a view, a modern day view from just if you drive to the end and then look back towards Kaʻū, to the highway area. There's this pali here that is, I think, informally called Kahuku Pali. It has a couple of other Hawaiian names, native Hawaiian names. But if you have that vantage point, you can see where the 1868 lava flow came down and skirted the very edge of that pali. And I'll show a map of that later. But here's a drawing from 1868 of that same vantage point. And you can see this several lava fountain features that fed lava flows that traveled downslope and skirted the edge of that pali. So at the time, they were estimating that the fountain heights were up to 500 feet high. So Captain Brown, the eruption started just above his property, as we just heard, and then they wrote about this event as well. On Tuesday the 7th, about 5 p.m., the family of Captain Brown were startled by an explosion and a terrific roar about 2 miles from their house. At once, they saw several jets of lava mounting upward nearly 1,000 feet, while smoke and steam shot up to the clouds. The glare of the fire caused a lurid light far and near, while the lava was seen coming down rapidly upon their doomed dwelling. The family and the natives about the premise ran for their lives, first in a wrong direction, happily soon corrected by Mr. Swain, whose presence of mind pointed out that up the mountain and across the gulch was the only chance of escape. Panting and excited, the people gained the farther bank, when in a few minutes the glowing lava poured through the gulch, filling it in with a stream of living fire. The stream parted at the source to join again further down. On an enclosed space of grassy land, more than 200 head of cattle were feeding. So here they're describing how the lava flow branched and then came back together, and there were 200 cattle that were trapped and eventually covered with lava. So today out on the highway, there's actually a monument to Captain Brown's lost residence that you can still visit today. And then there was I guess he had lost a daughter before the eruption. She didn't die in the eruption, but after the lava flow covered his property, he located her grave site and was able to move her body somewhere else. So here are some maps of the eruption that Kohn made when he visited the eruption site months later, and you can see, I mean, for the times, I think he did a fairly good job. So here's the actual modern map of the lava flow. And then here's that mud flow that we talked about here in Wood Valley in Pahala. So the eruption was pretty brief. It only lasted 5 days long. Some Mauna Loa eruptions can last over a year. The lava flows were 10 miles. The source vents, which are just here in the park, and you can visit them, They reached the ocean in just a few hours, and they covered about 5,000 acres. And at the coast, there was a littoral cone built up where the, I think it's the next slide, where the lava entered the ocean. Here's another interesting photo of a family that was actually trapped in the lava flow, branched and then came back together, and then that's called a kipuka, and they were trapped there for, they say, I think, about a week before they could be rescued. And so here are some aerial shots of the lava flow. So we talked about it, starting and then skirting the edge of the pali. So you can see it come down here in dark black. And then this is also a different branch of that same lava flow. Here's the cone that it built when it entered the ocean. And this is called pu'uho, which means, I think it means new cone. And then the other really interesting thing about this eruption is that the lava is called a pickrite. You can go hike just near here on top of this lava flow, and you'll notice that it has quite a lot of olivine. And the thinking is that the vents, let me go back to this map, the vents for this eruption were at a relatively low elevation on the southwest rift zone. So here's the vent location, and the summit is up here. And if you were to take a three-dimensional cutout of the volcano, the magma chamber is below the summit. But this eruption happened at a relatively low elevation, and it erupted a pickrite, they think, because it tapped into magma in the magma chamber that is, the magma chamber is compositionally zoned, meaning that the way I think about it actually is like a chocolate chip cookie. You mix everything together and you've got the chunks of chocolate, but as you bake it, those chunks of chocolate might melt and mix in with the rest of the cookie. In a magma chamber, the magma is really hot, everything's mixed in together, but as it cools, you might get crystals forming in that magma. And those crystals are going to be heavy and dense and sink to the bottom. And so that's what this likely represents, is kind of the bottom of that magma chamber where the olivine crystals have kind of settled out. And so because this eruption happened at a relatively low elevation, it probably tapped into that lower part of the magma chamber. In hindsight, there was likely also what happened, a partial summit collapse at Mauna Loa. So for those of you who are here in 2018, we're very familiar with this sequence of events that happened at Kilauea, where there was a flank eruption relatively low on the volcano, and then at the summit there was the summit partially collapsed because so much magma from that summit magma chamber was erupted lower on the flank of the volcano that the roof of the magma reservoir is unsupported, so it collapses down. And that likely also happened in 1868 on Mauna Loa. So this map on the left was done by Wilkes in 1840 or 1841, yeah. And you can see that there's this kind of odd-shaped partial crater, maybe some eruptions filled in over here, and then, yeah, the main caldera is kind of extending over here, and a little pit crater. In September 1872, there were observations, the people weren't visiting the summit very frequently, so we have to kind of piece it together based on these sparse records. But in 1872, some folks visited the summit caldera and noted that you can see this area is much larger, and it's actually circular now. And then the caldera itself was likely a little bit wider. And they also noted in the center that there was a pit. So, the quotes, 1/3 of the floor of the crater is much lower than the rest, and it has evidently subsided since Wilkes's visit. The depressed portion may be 200 or 300 feet below the other. And Thomas Jagger, who founded the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory, he kind of put this together too. And he said that there was another survey about 33 years after Wilkes. So Wilkes was in 1841, and then there was another survey 33 years later. Lydgate's survey 33 years after Wilkes notes higher western and eastern walls of the caldera and a larger and deeper southern pit. The northern embayment had become an elliptical pit, and the lunate platforms had sunk deeper and changed proportions. A new southwest extension of the main crater floor contained active lava in 1874, and it was the scene of lava fountains for years after 1872. So yeah, it's really interesting to look back at these events now that we've experienced 2018 in the modern kind of monitoring realm and seen what a summit collapse can look like. And Frank Truesdale has done some work digitizing these maps that Jagger made based on those observations. And his estimate is that the collapse of Mauna Loa in 1868 may have been bigger than that of Kilauea in 2018, which is just, yeah, amazing to think about because Kilauea in 2018 was so large. So this photo on the left, for those of you who weren't here in 2018, this is Kilauea's summit before it collapsed in 2018, and then this is after it collapsed. And again, the parallels between 1868 and 2018 are really interesting in that both of them had these lower elevation eruptions and large earthquakes and big flank movements. And so the idea that maybe Mauna Loa had a summit collapse, partial summit collapse too, is not, yeah, it makes sense.
Well, that's not it. There it is. All right, so that's our fifth stage here. Summit collapse, lava going into the ocean in just 3.5 hours. We have their account from that ship is the one that actually tells us that, right? They talk about that Oddfellow schooner having a deck of the ship covered with very fine ash on the morning of the 7th. That's where this comes from. That's the report we're looking at earlier. We have this one up here. Yeah. Just to elaborate, that same day that they're noticing the ashes, the people on a ship are coming ashore. They're looking at all the destruction. They find dead animals. They find the body of a native woman lying among the rocks, their right leg bitten off at the knee and otherwise horribly mutilated by the sharks. So this is all traumatic going on and on and on. And it's not just what's happening every single day, but there's all this accumulated trauma coming as well there to make sure you keep that in mind. There are other accounts of people visiting the lava as well. This is the account of Whitney approaching the flow. They see cinders, they see Pele's hairs. They note that the lava was mostly pahoehoe on the one side. They note that it began about 2 miles back of Captain Brown's house. And I didn't mention earlier, because there's so much to keep in mind here, but during that 7/9 earthquake, they had a 80-foot diameter pit open in the back of this guy's house. And they said they could not see the bottom of the thing. And there was steam coming out of it after the 7/9 earthquake. So you know that the 7/9 earthquake opened a rift zone more. Magma was down in there, moving under his house. And a few days later, it actually erupted not far from there, right? After all this stuff happened in Kilauea, further on, the dominoes keep hitting east. But in Kaʻū, it's still from the summit down the pattern of the eruption there. So on the Salina Ridge, we found the eruption in full blast. 4 enormous fountains in a line a mile long, north and south, were continually spouting up from the opening. These jets were blood red and as fluid as water, ever varying in size, bulk, and height. Sometimes 2 would join together, and again, the whole 4 would be united, making one continuous fountain a mile in length. And talk about the lava running all the way down to the ocean. It was a very fluid lava. I talk about the gas coming out there and rotating on its way up, reaching the ocean. The atmosphere was filled with smoke so dense the sun appeared like a ball of fire, and the whole island was shrouded in darkness. Smoke came from the rent or crater, and it's highly charged with sulfur. So lots of gas being emitted then as well. Lava going to the ocean, making, they note the air is highly charged with sulfurous gas and electricity. Frequent flashes of lightning were seen directly over the lava stream, accompanied with short claps of thunder. These flashes were observed less frequently further up the mountain. Shower of ashes and pumice stone from this crater to a distance of 10 or 15 miles each way, generally 1 or 2 inches in depth, but in some places 15 inches in depth. Some pieces were carried by the wind at great distance. 2 and 3 inches diameter, floated ashore at Kahuku, 45 miles distance. So a long way away, this stuff is falling, as we now know is normal today. And here's one of these final accounts of, in the end, at the time, what they thought: houses destroyed and deaths. And this was just Kaʻū. Just Kaʻū. They say 1 life in Puna by the sea wave, 1 in Hilo by a falling cliff. I think this was a couple, and I think the woman later died also, so it might have been 2, and nothing's quite updated, but there you go. It's more or less a ballpark. About 100 people or so was the impact of that. So, all right, let's come to our sequence here, and I believe now we'll let her start wrapping it up here with some of the consequences and what we have seen next from there.
So in terms of impacts, the 1868 event was really devastating. At least 100 houses were destroyed and many more were damaged. The roads in Kaʻū were cracked and displaced by several feet. Even roads in Hilo were cracked and displaced by up to a foot. At least 1,300 cattle were killed. And then in 1868 dollars, the damage was 70,000. If you translate that to today, it's about $1.5 million in damage. The number of fatalities is hard to estimate, but low estimates maybe in the 70s, high estimates in the 80s. At least 30 people were killed by that mud flow, and then several by the tsunami and the other rock falls around the island. There was also fog reported in Honolulu for the days of the eruption. So let's see, they wrote, the smoke, and this is from Honolulu, the smoke of the volcano which hung about Honolulu for 3 or 4 days, being observed the first on Friday the 10th, was also seen by Captain Stone on the Brigham Kamehameha V at sea. So they're talking about fog being observed also at sea, 400 miles west of Honolulu. The sun on Friday with him, as with us, rose shorn of its accustomed brightness and could be looked at comfortably with the named eye. So you could look at the sun because there was so much fog. And for those of you, sorry, fog is volcanic air pollution, for those of you that aren't from here. And for 4 days, the whole atmosphere was thick with smoke. And then they wrote of Kaʻū, the land all through Waiahinu is badly fissured and moved. In one place on the road to the landing of Ka'alualu, the action is distinctly marked by fissure, on one side of which the road is displaced several feet. And in 1868, Kamehameha V, he did launch a relief effort. You know, it took several days for news of all this devastation to reach him in Honolulu. And then by April 18th, the local newspapers were kind of reporting that he was proposing an aid trip. And then, oops, I may have those switched, sorry. April 15th, the newspaper reports, and then April 18th, his relief effort was arriving in Hilo. And they delivered aid to about 800 people, food, lumber, and clothes. And they wrote, the newspapers kind of wrote of his relief effort. On his arrival at Hilo, he sent messengers through the district notifying the people of his arrival. At Hilo, he met the destitute on the 17th and spent 8 hours distributing clothing to 110 persons. At Keauhou, relief was given to 68 men, women, and children. At Punalu'u, clothing and lumber were distributed to 364. At Ka'alualu, the greatest destitution prevailed, and some were really famishing. Here, food, clothing, and lumber were distributed to 257, in all about 800 persons. So the other interesting thing I noticed was that the earlier newspapers were kind of advertising tickets for tourists to go and look at the eruption on the steamship Kilauea. And they were being advertised at $40, which would be equivalent to just under $1,000 by today's numbers. But that in subsequent newspapers, they report that trip postponed because Kamehameha V, he used the Kilauea steamer to go deliver that aid. The other interesting thing is that now, you know, in the period after 2018, we've been at Kilauea, been having mostly summit eruptions following that big collapse. And the same thing happened at Mauna Loa after the 1868 eruption. So for the next 10 plus years, there were only summit eruptions. So one in 1871, and then from 1872 to 1877, there was kind of nearly continuous summit eruptive activity, 1877, 1879, 1880. So it wasn't until 1881 that the first eruption outside of Mauna Loa's summit caldera happened. And so here are just some illustrations of what that summit activity looked like. And so there was one specific area that there were lava fountains were often noted, and some of these were pretty visible even from Hilo. And so a sketch of that area too here.
Oh, where's the button? There it is. All right. So we gotta do a little more here. There are some consequences here that were mentioned. Shift of cement activity, and I'm going to add a couple more: disruption of Mauna Loa magma chemistry and aftershock pattern of earthquakes for the last 150 years here. But Dane, I think I need like a 3-minute intermission here to make sure my power is not going to cut out on me. Maybe you can.
All right, let's go ahead and we'll take it up. Go ahead.
Then I'll come back and I'll probably have another 10 minutes to go or something like that.
All right, so we'll go ahead and bring on Lou. How you doing, Lou?
Getting a lot of information. You know, I filmed that down in Kahuku, you know, when Katie did that presentation, and all these Volcano Awareness Month presentations are set at 1 hour, and there is so much more in there than what she put out there. I just linked the video, so if anybody wants to go watch the entire thing, because Katie covers a lot of other stuff as well. I see some of the chat. A lot of you like the old newspaper clippings. She has a bunch in there as well as photographs and stuff. So check that out. But what an event when it's broke down like this.
Right, for sure. A lot to cover. You know, we're way over right now, but that's what happens when you dive into something. But hey, why don't we go ahead and do our donation stuff right now, since we got a minute? You got that stuff ready?
Not yet. Give me a second. I will say our number was 30. We're at $3,376 with tonight's donation. So thank you very much for that.
I'll go ahead and shout out those. So we did have one from Scudget Ed at the beginning. We had one from Winch at $20. Says thank you for all you do. Appreciate that. We had one from Dennis Gillespie at $20. No comment there. We had a Dennis Hyman, the Battle of the Dennises, $20. Can't let Dennis be the only Dennis contributing. Appreciate that. And then $20 from Ken. It takes real courage and conviction to review this event. May all be informed and encouraged to prepare for any possible future events.
Cool.
Appreciate the support there. And if you do like to make donations, we also take those on hvery.org/donate. There you go. And yeah, those are tax deductible donations there, and it really goes a long ways to helping us continue this work.
Absolutely. All right, ready to roll it? Here we go. Let's see if it works here. There we go. Hopefully the audio is okay, not too loud. This month has been fantastic. We're winding down. Sunday will be our last day. Like Dane just put up on there. After tonight, hvery.org/donate is where you can send us a donation. $3,376. Our goal was up there. We put a high bar up there. We think we've reached it, and we did a fantastic job with all of you donating to us. We couldn't be much more just appreciative of everything. So read the names. Go.
Oh God, I'm doing it. Tom, Catherine, Larry M, Brian G, Pat, Tiggy, Gustav, Mamo, Sky, Breezy, Lisa, Gina, Jana, Mary, Tom,
Julie, Laura, James, Kimberly, Joshua, Kim.
Yeah, that's our celebration for just getting through it.
That's right.
the entire list we did the entire list there, in case you didn't notice.
Yes. Yes,
right,
I thought we'd throw some fireworks up for tonight. So thank you again, everybody, for participating and helping us out. Every dollar makes a difference. Still time to donate and keep pushing that bar up. hvery.org/donate. And there it is right there on the screen.
Right.
Phil, did you catch the last clip on there with you up there at Mauna Loa? I had to pull one out.
No, I didn't have to look for that next time here. I'm trying to make sure all my ducks are in a row here for the last run.
Cool. The final sprint. You think you're ready?
Take them home.
Yep, I'm good now. Yep.
All right.
Okay, so
let's get your thing back up there, and there we go.
All right, so yeah, she mentioned shift of cement activity. We'll talk about that first, perhaps here. Right, so One thing that's interesting, I mean, we saw the parallels to Kilauea already, but what I wanted to point out here is that we actually have this earthquake cycle. And we've been talking about this paper in Mauna Loa for a long time, how big earthquakes can lead to stress changes in the magma system, which can then trigger eruptions, which can then trigger earthquakes, which can then trigger eruptions. And this may be one of the best examples of this we actually have, even though it's going across two volcanoes here, of how this can really cascade its way down there. So I'll just bring up this interaction here. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about this in short little chunks. One earthquake might lead to something else happening in this rift zone. We're talking about little mini clips of this whole convoluted 1868 sequence of events there. And so that's just one thing to mention there. There was several things she talked about there as well. One was the rescue party from Kamehameha coming in. There was actually a Volcano Watch article back in 2003 about this. And one thing I wanted to point out is just, I mean, there's all kinds of cool stuff in here, but everything that Katie recalled, but there's one thing that I thought was interesting in here about the land use here. So let's see if I can find the part where they actually come in here. So Hilo work. Okay, here we go. The king himself took depositions on extent of losses and post-disaster needs from each head of household in Hilo. His Excellency's extensive land holdings in Puna were parceled into single-family units, and some were awarded to the most hard-hit victims. So if you're wondering what they did back then for relocation, this has been an issue of trying to coexist with lava flows in a volcano for a long time here, back to the era of this relief effort of Kamehameha. So lots of cool stuff in here. I'll leave that one at that, though. I wanted to talk about some of the other effects to start, these more geologic effects. And one of these is a paper published. It's been a little while now. What year was this here? 2006? No, I think that's the right year. Anyway, so this goes back to Tilling, Rhodes, Sparks, Lockwood, and Lipman, all retired USGS HVO alumni now. And what they're saying is that let's see here. Essentially, in 1868, the change to the magma system of Mauna Loa was enough that all the signals of the chemistry of magma was disrupted after that. So maybe it's easier if I just show you the graphs since I'm a little off balance here, but there is the graph of the various elements, strontium, zirconium, niobium here, where the earthquake occurs. And you could draw this like, okay, we're going to call this a steady decline and average it out and just call it like that. But they're saying, no, we're going to actually interpret this as this was like this, and then it broke off in all three places, most obviously the niobium here, and everything since then has been a different chemistry than before then, right? And that would make sense because, as Katie said, the vent was very low on the flank of the volcano, drained a lower part of the magma chamber, put out all those olivine crystals in that form of that pickrite flow, as you mentioned. And so by doing that, you might disrupt the entire chemistry because you're bringing in new magma and you change what was in there before. So that's one aspect of it. The other thing here is also mentioned in this paper, lava production rate for Mauna Loa decreases by more than a factor after, in this case, 1877, they say, right? But there is that earlier rate and the later rate, right? 1877 is a year that the summit activity that follows this flank eruption Mauna Loa actually ends. And so that's how that all fits together there. So everything shifting to the summit, the rate then slows down. You have more room in the volcano, ultimately, if you have all this earthquakes moving everything out of the way, opening all your rift zones, draining your magma chamber down to a very low spot. That's about as disruptive as you can be. So it was a big, important geological consequence here. And the other one is this paper by Klein and Wright from 2007, Exponential Decline of Aftershocks of the 7.9 Great Kaʻū Earthquake through the 20th Century. Right? So there's a few caveats to put in here, though, right? One, there are all kinds of volcanic events, swarms that occur and come in. We do have to take those out. The volcanic pattern is not what you're talking about here. We're talking about the aftershock sequence that you would expect after a big event and having events continue for a while and tailing off. The other thing is that you have continuous magma movement, right? So magma can be pushing the ground a lot, but as Dane said earlier, most of the earthquakes are actually fairly small. So what they've done here is they've put in a threshold of magnitude 5.2. We're looking at earthquakes above 5.2, which most of those are likely to be big earthquakes, maybe aftershocks of this thing, or not directly the magma, but some other big flank earthquake of their own, in fact. Right, so there's all kinds of math in here, but I'll cut that in the chase. There's the generally accepted model of what areas broke what parts of it. 75 was that footprint, and 68 was all of that, right? But with this in between, like what's happening here to cause an eruption in 1868 as well. Complication. And let's come down to here's the graph we're looking at. Magnitude 5.2 earthquakes catalog back from 1820 into the 2000s here. This is the main shock, the Great Earthquake right here. So what you expect is a nice exponential decline of this thing over time. Right? So that's basically what you get. You get a couple, well, there is an earthquake swarm, subtract that, there's another one, there's another one. That's why they're all labeled on here. But basically what they're saying is earthquakes occurring even into the 2000s over 5.2 in this area fit into the aftershock pattern of this event 150 years ago. Take that with a grain of salt. They're slowing down a lot now. So if we were to get another magnitude 7, that wouldn't be an aftershock. It's been too long, but it just goes to show like this was a significant disruptor of the entire system, right? And in fact, you might even argue that it had some effect on Mauna Loa long term beyond just this little thing that happened more locally within this decade of eruption. It could have gone on for longer than that. But all that said, this is a well-known paper of the aftershock sequence following that earthquake, and how, if you hear someone from USGS nowadays talk about an earthquake that's shallow on Kaʻū, maybe it was an aftershock from 1868. This is where this idea comes from. It's got to be big enough and fit within this pattern and infrequent enough nowadays. But back in the first 10 years, that was clearly, this is the most important part of the curve there, right? When it was still a lot of data coming in, it was all still matching. So there's that. That's the other consequence too. And I thought the other thing that we really should talk about as the final consequence is just like the change to the land all the way down. And a lot of the accounts that are put out by people are people who arrived after the fact. And so I've tried to save or filter those a little bit here, but we'll come back to Cone one more time. And just to note that he did a tour, right, in August of 1868, several months later, to go around and see what he actually saw. So that said, when he says this happened on April 2nd or April 4th, he doesn't know, because that's not when he was here looking at this stuff. He's looking at the cumulative, after all the 16 days are over, a couple months later, what does the whole island look like? So he tours from Hilo to Kapoho, not a whole lot of unusual stuff. There's cracks and stuff like that. Rock walls had fallen over, but nothing remarkable, right? From the East Cape to the south point of the island, Kīlauea, the disturbance had been great. The whole coastline appears to be undergone a subsidence of unequal depth. At Keahialaka, about 7 miles southwest of Kapoho, where there's been a pool of brackish water passed by a causeway of stones, the water now stands at high tide 3 to 4 feet deep and spread out among coconut groves where water was never seen before. At Kaimu, the sea has been driven in a heavy beach of lava sand for 200 feet into a beautiful young coconut grove and spoiled a delightful lawn. So this is perhaps when the black sand beach at Kaimu started to form, when it starts washing in. And ruins the lawn. At Kalapana, the sand beach has been forced into groves of pandanus and coconut, where the trees now stand 6 to 8 feet deep in sand, and the shoreline has been pressed back in a distance of 100 feet. So, yeah, in the context of Pohuiki now, we can understand these kind of changes. The old stone church is nearly buried in sand, and the tide rises and falls within its walls. It formerly stood 200 feet from the water. The plain of Kalapana has sunk 4 to 6 feet, and many acres of once dry land are now covered with water 3 and 4 feet deep. Bathing coves, once having spaces of 3, 4, and 6 feet between a water and a roof, are now full, or nearly so. At Kalakomo, the salt works are all destroyed, and a spring of cold water among the rocks near the shore is sunk. At Apua, the most western village in Puna, all the houses, a crescent, sand beach, and a beautiful little canoe harbor are obliterated. The fishermen mourn. Water now stands where the village once stood. The same is true of Keoho, the most eastern village of Kaʻū. The substance there is 7 feet by measurement upon the coconut trees. This place has ample and safe anchorage, and here was a station where large quantities of pulu were dried, pressed, and shipped for market. The influx of the sea destroyed the buildings, but proprietors have built again on higher rocks. A map that his daughter drew there. In passing from Puna to Kaʻū, we took a high trail. They go and they find that little lava flow in a southwest rift. I'll kind of skip over some of that. Okay. They cross 1823. They're all going to a meeting. They talk about how just trying to get across the road is really difficult because of all the cracks. Our cavalcade numbered 16, all natives but myself, going to Kilauea to attend our meeting of the association. And had it not been for an expert guide who marched us north, south, east, and west, who zigzagged us, taught our horses to leap over fissures, and performed a score of necessary evolutions, we could not have passed that region of marvelous fractures and fissures from 1 to 25 feet wide. At last, we're all crossed over. They go and find the other lava flow. He goes and spends the night at Kapapala. I want to come back to the coastline here. Let's see here. They talk about, he's talked about seeing the mud flow. He talks about the mud flow. It's not mud, it's all land. Everything is dry. He goes through all of that through here. He measures it all more accurately. Mud flow. From Ke'iva, I went down to Punalu'u and thence along the shore to Honuapo. All is wreck and ruin along this coast. Churches, dwellings, yards, causeways, roads, fish ponds, canoes, fish nets, tackle, gear, furniture, and all things movable were destroyed. In many places the road is sunk or so bloated with debris that without a guide I could not have threaded my way along the shore and through villages once so familiar to me. At Punalu'u and Honuapo, I took measurements on the palms and the rivers of A'a, and the height of the earthquake waves of April 2nd. The greatest height was 20 feet. The sand beach at Punalu'u was swept out to sea by the receding waves, and a beautiful pond of cold water filled with the ocean and apparently blotted out forever. At length, however, the sea brought back her spoils and formed another sand barrier more than 100 feet within the old line, leaving a few pools of water inside and protecting them from the ocean surges. But the great, deep, cool, and beautiful fish pond is not there in its normal state. The same is true at Honuapo and along the coast. So on and on and on. I'll stop it there, but I just wanted to share with people who are residents of Hawaii who know a lot of these coastal areas, right? A lot of us like to try to go beaches here, and we've seen beaches change, how much change that occurred then and how impactful it actually all was. So that is the end of what I'll say with Cone there, and coming here to our sequence of events. That's obviously more the human impact. This is the geologic impacts, right? Shift some activity, disruption in the chemistry, a large aftershock pattern, and all that. And in the end, people had to recover from what a traumatic 16 days that they had here. So I think actually we'll wrap it up there, and we can entertain questions if there are any. I know we've gone a long time. There's apologize for that.
Good amount of questions type of thing. We could be here for another.
I mean, we could. I mean,
really
the thing is, like, right? Imagine that we were trying to talk about 2018 all in one day. That's what we're trying to do here, but it's actually even bigger 2018. And we're trying to really condense and make sense of the whole stuff, but there was just so much that happened in such a short time. So let's look at some of the questions.
Okay, so question from Facebook: How can you determine that some of the earthquakes are still aftershocks of 1868 when there was no instrumentation or instrumentation to triangulate the epicenter? What evidence is used today to link this to that quake?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, in truth, the region isn't very large of that side of Mauna Loa, right? So the actual exact location isn't super crucial to having other events in that area as well. So we've discussed in the past, like, how I personally will, have a different definition of aftershock sequence, and this needs to be constrained in time and space, right? So to me, 150 years is too long to have an aftershock sequence. But what you're saying is that this decay pattern of earthquakes occurring after that big one it all fits, and you see a lot of earthquakes that you could easily interpret as that. That's not the only interpretation. You have to obviously say, okay, you're ignoring a lot of volcano stuff happening there, which clearly all that is happening. But there is that interesting pattern that's happening as well. So I wouldn't take it too strictly, like, yeah, they're all aftershocks necessarily. I just wanted to point out that that's one of the ways that scientists think about this. But yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Question from Nicholas: There were beaches longer and more broad back in 1860, hence more beach for tsunamis to run up. Did Kilauea have any small cones like Mauna Loa or Kilauea at the time?
So the beaches certainly were all different shapes, but this wave is originating offshore below the elevation of any of these beaches. So it's having to run up the shoreline without the beaches having that big an effect on what's actually happening with the wave is my opinion on that. And as far as what it looked like, as far as having small cones, it likely did, right? A lot of eruptions back in that era were in the Southwest Rift, so all those Southwest Rift cones would have been ones that you would have been seeing recently active or soon to be active. I don't think there were nearly as many in the East Rift. Apart from at that era, there was 1840 was the first eruption down in the Nana Valley eruption, right? That went from Nana Valley Estates today and flowed north to the Sandhills area where it made an ocean entry and littoral cones similar to what you see down at near South Point for this 1868 eruption.
All right. Yvonne asks, where can I find these slides in the paper? Interested in it. A lot of different stuff in there.
You can't yet because I just put it together today. So that would be great to compile it all at some point. But yeah, normally when I do these compilations, the data is a lot more prepared in advance. And the reason maybe they went a extra long today is I just found so much stuff that I thought was too interesting. I thought I had to build the full story and not do this in 4 parts over a whole month or something, so we can all have it in context. So
I think
if
you could
I'll
have
follow
done
up with
that.
you,
Could have done that.
You forget part 1
There's
by
so
part
much.
2 by part 3 by part 4 by part 5. You know what I mean? Like, and it all happened this week. Like, this is the week. This is the anniversary week. So this would have been a 16-day chunk. It all happened at once. And I figure, yeah, a couple hours condensed. Maybe that's the best I could do in short notice here.
All right.
But maybe I will try to get some stuff together and release it at some point in the future here to get it all together. Yeah, but
then Nicholas, did Mauna Loa's summit collapse have an explosive component like Kilauea in 2018?
that's a good question. Kilauea's summit explosions were very little of volume. You might have had like less than 1%. So if you were to go today, let's say after the fact, and look for deposits of explosions in Kilauea from 2018, you wouldn't find anything. It'd be hard to separate that from all the other tephra that's of that same size around Kilauea summit, you know. So it's not been found that I know of distinctly on Mauna Loa, but you maybe wouldn't expect to find it either. So that's what I would say there. It's hard to know, but there's nothing distinctly being found. There are explosive deposits on Mauna Loa summit. We've discussed those in the past, but that's thought to be older than this. So it can happen, but I don't think it happened in this particular case.
One interesting thing for me would be the idea of low volume ash with collapses, kind of like similar to the back half of 2018. And the real thing about that was the intervals between them were so regular and predictable. But if you're having a bunch of 5.0s and stuff mixed in from all around the south flank, how would you ever know without instrumentation that this 5.0 was aftershock, but that 5.0 that was a collapse from Mauna Loa or something? It just would blend, it seems like to me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, and obviously they didn't have any instrumentation there in the 1800s, like, so they're really picking up they're using the reports. So the Lymans kept really good earthquake journals, and you know, every time there was a little shake, they'd write something in their journal. It's April 4th, it's 7 p.m. I felt a little shake. That could be enough, right? Or it was really strong, my computer fell off the wall, or whatever, you know, whatever happens to be. That's right.
And also those intervals, correct me if I'm wrong, but those intervals weren't really well known of before 2018 that they would be so regular and that they would even happen like that. The collapses, yeah. Yeah, and sometimes they are more regular and sometimes they're not, depending on the situation. Other volcanoes worldwide during collapse events have been studied recently. Right. So we still have a lot to learn on that. We really don't know much of the details on that. But it's cool to think about now that you know that there was a collapse of Mauna Loa and a collapse of Kilauea in the same year around all this other stuff happening.
that was the goal. So yeah,
Right.
good question.
I think that'll do it for questions for now. We're way over right now, but thanks everybody for that stuck around through this. I know we did a long one, so everybody that stuck in there, we appreciate you. Putting in the long viewing session. We appreciate that.
Yeah, if you watch this later on, then appreciate you coming back and coming through to the end. We still have some people, several dozen people are still in here. So
Right.
mahalo, you guys. Appreciate you. And yeah, I've talked long enough.
Yeah. Well, we already did the donation stuff while you were checking the power. So appreciate everybody for tuning in today. Make sure to like, subscribe, share, and yeah, appreciate the support.
Thanks, Dane. So yeah, with that said, we'll wrap it up here. And from HVary, until next week, there is a chance we'll do something different next week a little bit too, like similar to this, but we'll have to wait and see. We're going to hear back on some of that. So, but still, regular time, 5 p.m. on Thursday, unless something else happens ahead of time, we'll be back. So from HVary today, Thursday, April 4th, 156 years after that 1868 sequence. Dane DuPont, I'm Philip Ong. Aloha, everybody.